Are you something more than a thought? You're sitting, you can feel the weight of your body, the air around you, the sound of this voice that floats in your ears. Everything seems normal, stable, real, but the question sneaks in like a fine crack in glass. How do you know that all this is real? Not in a poetic sense, nor in a dreamlike metaphor, but literally, how do you know that the world in which you believe, the body that you believe you inhabit, the memories that you carry with such certainty are not being provided to you by something else? A machine, perhaps a program, an experiment, or something that you will never see or understand. This is the mental experiment of the brain in a vat, one of the most quietly terrifying ideas of modern philosophy. Imagine a human brain, yours, floating in a sealed vat, with its neurons connected to a powerful computer. That machine sends signals to your brain, mimicking the exact patterns of sight, hearing, touch, taste, memory, emotions, and even the sensation of choosing from your perspective. Everything seems perfectly normal. The world appears, people talk, the days pass, you feel pain and pleasure, but none of that is real. There is no body, there is no world, only electrical stimulation and a mind that believes it is alive. The idea is disturbing, not because it is far-fetched or unlikely, but because we have no way to refute it. All our evidence of the world comes from our senses, and if those senses can be imitated to perfection, then reality becomes indistinguishable from illusion. Rationally, we could reject the idea, since it sounds like science fiction, but that is part of what makes it so disturbing, because the more we delve into artificial intelligence, virtual reality, and brain-computer interfaces, the more the line blurs. At some point, perhaps even now, someone could be living in a completely fabricated world without any idea that the world around them is not real. Someone or everyone, you might think, but I feel real. You could trust your memories, your sense of continuity. You could say, I have free will, I can choose, I can reflect, I can doubt. But even those things can doubt memory. Identity can be simulated. And if your brain is the only thing you know for sure exists, then everything else could just be theater. We assume that we are the ones who think about the world. But what if the world is thinking about us, projecting everything we experience without exit and without explanation? What if you're the only real one in a world of perfect copies? Let's delve deeper. We assume that we are surrounded by other minds, people who feel, think, and see the world like us. But what if some of them only seem like that? What if behind the eyes there is nothing, no monsters, no machines, only zombies with the perfect mask of being human, philosophical zombies? People who feel nothing? You greet them warmly, you talk, you share, you open your inner world hoping that they will meet you halfway. And they do. They nod, they respond, they maintain eye contact, their face moves as a face should move when it understands, but still something feels empty, like a script recited without soul. The idea seems impossible, that someone can look and act exactly like a conscious being and yet have no inner world, no thoughts, no consciousness, no pain, no joy, no echo inside their skull when the world calls them. Just an impeccable interpretation of personality. This is the disturbing proposal that hides behind the philosophical zombie, a hypothetical being identical to a human in all observable aspects, behavior, biology, reactions, but totally devoid of experience. He eats, sleeps, laughs, apologizes, maybe even falls in love, but internally there is only static, and this is what makes the idea disturbing. We would not know the difference. There's no test, no trick question, no moment in which the illusion breaks. They would say that they feel love, they would swear that they feel pain, and they would also believe it, but belief does not require consciousness, only programming. This idea is not about monsters. It is about how fragile our understanding of consciousness really is, how all our assumptions about others are based on how they act, not on what they feel. But if someone could behave exactly like a conscious being without really being one, then we would be left with a terrifying uncertainty. Who is real and how many are not? Even worse, how do you know that you are not one of them? Because you say that you feel, that you think, that you dream. But what if those thoughts are just habits? What if everything you believe about being alive is just the next line in a script? We like to believe that consciousness is sacred, that it lives behind every pair of eyes. But perhaps in some quiet corner of the world or of the room in which you are right now, someone is staring through the glass, responding, reacting, repeating, but inside there is nothing. And what if you're the only one who is not pretending? Next, we descend further into the shadows of something even worse than illusion. A world not only made of falsehoods, but one in which all of reality itself could be endlessly fabricated and superimposed. Simulation, layer, hypothesis, reality under reality. You wake up in a world that seems intact. The air moves, the light curves, people talk and react as if everything around you is anchored to something solid and reliable. You assume without question that this base is real, but what if that assumption is just part of the design? We have heard the whispers that this world could be a simulation, a vast artificial dream sown by distant creators. It is a disturbing thought, but one that can almost be managed if reality is false. At least it is a simulation, a single layer to unravel. But then the deeper question arises, what if it does not stop there? What if this simulation exists within another, and that within yet another? What if reality is not a deception, but a chain of illusions stacked endlessly on top of each other? Not like peeling layers to find the truth, but peeling forever only to discover that there was never anything underneath. The simulation layer hypothesis not only disrupts our understanding of reality, but disorients our understanding of truth itself. If every frame you enter is part of a larger fiction, then nothing of what you touch is foundation, not even the doubt you feel, especially the doubt which could have been programmed for you. You could spend your whole life chasing freedom, thinking that if you manage to break through the current layer, you will finally see what is real, but the design is recursive. Each layer looks like the previous one, and the moment you start to see the seams, the world changes shape to hide them. Perhaps the creators do not even know that they are being simulated. Perhaps there were never creators. Perhaps what we call consciousness is nothing more than a fault that updates itself and drifts through the layers hoping to wake up. And if that is true, then everything, your memories, your fears, your questions, could belong to someone else's story. Not because they have been taken from you, but because you never had them. But if your world can be false, and the people who inhabit it might not be real, then what about you? Because the next thought, the next fear, cuts even deeper. What if you are being watched, not only by others, but by the world itself, and not to control you, but to observe you? Ontological paranoia. When the world becomes a representation, most of the time, you move through the world with a quiet sense of continuity. Things behave as they should. The ground remains under your feet. The sun rises. People talk. When spoken to, there is a rhythm, a structure that tells you that reality is coherent, objective, stable. But from time to time, that structure slips. You feel that someone is watching you, not in the physical sense, not from behind a tree or across the street, but from behind the world itself. It is the disturbing feeling that reality around you is aware of you in some way, that the coincidences, the repetitions, the too perfect moments are not just chance, but are designed. You start to wonder if the people around you are playing a role, if the things they say were written before you arrived, if the world not only behaves, but is acting. This is the slow descent into ontological paranoia, the fear that reality itself is not what it claims to be and that it may be watching you. It begins with doubt, a look that lasts too long, a stranger who seems too familiar, a conversation that seems rehearsed. Your brain points it out, but your instincts try to silence it. You want to believe that the world is random, indifferent, that your presence does not shape it. But the feeling grows. You start to wonder if the things around you react to you or react for you. Ontological paranoia does not scream. It murmurs just below your consciousness. It convinces you that something is wrong, but it never lets you confirm it. It is not about being followed. It is about the fear that everything has been planned and that you are the only one who has not been told. It is the suspicion that there is a script and you are improvising on a stage that you have not built. We trust that reality is neutral, oblivious to our lives. But what if that neutrality is an illusion? What if reality is not simply indifferent towards you, but curious? What if it cannot be trusted to tell the truth? What happens when your own mind starts to lie to you? Next, we face a more intimate betrayal. The disturbing realization that the voice in your head, the narrator of your life, might not be reliable at all. Unreliable narrators in consciousness. When your mind becomes the distraction, a voice in your head, you don't always hear it directly, but it's there weaving thoughts together, making sense of the chaos, assigning meaning to every flash of your experience. It tells you what just happened, why it's important, and what it says about you. It seems like the truth, but what if it isn't? In stories, an unreliable narrator is someone who tells their version of events in an incomplete, distorted, or dishonest way. Sometimes they lie, sometimes they believe their own illusions. In any case, the reader gradually realizes that the story cannot be trusted. But what if the same thing is happening inside your own head? We like to believe that consciousness is a reliable witness, that the thoughts we think are ours, and that our interpretation of reality is clear, coherent, and honest, but it is not. Not entirely. Our mind shapes the narrative to protect us, to preserve our identity, to defend our beliefs, to smooth over the cracks when we experience something painful or dissonant. Our minds rewrite, omit, soften the edges, give us explanations that make us feel good, not the ones that hold up under scrutiny, and sometimes they not only protect, but deceive. You may think that you have matured, that you have clearly seen bad things, that you understand yourself, but perhaps that is just the current version of the story. Perhaps your mind edits it on the fly, rearranging motives, hiding contradictions, forging a continuity that never existed. And there is the scary part. The narrator inside the system is narrating. You can't get out of yourself to check the veracity. You trust a voice that could be lying, and the liar is you. If you can't trust the story and you can't get out of the story, then who exactly is living? We consider ourselves the authors of our identity, but then we face a darker possibility, that the self is not an author at all, in fact, that it does not even exist. The death of the ego, the moment when the self crumbles. There's a moment in life when identity feels fragile, a breakup, a loss, a sudden collapse of meaning. We say we feel lost, as if we no longer know who we are, but that is just a crack. The death of the ego is the collapse under the ground. It is not despair, nor sadness. It is the slow and constant crumbling of the illusion that there is a central self that experiences all this, the one who makes the decisions, the one who owns the thoughts, the one who is supposed to keep everything together. You try to hold on to something familiar, your name, your memories, your preferences, but everything starts to seem distant, like props you once used in a story that no longer matters. You don't feel like you're floating above yourself. You feel like you've disappeared completely. Some seek this state on purpose through meditation, spiritual practice, or psychedelics. They call it awakening. But the experience itself is deeply disturbing because the self is not gently set aside, but dismantled layer by layer until there is no eye left to observe it. And when you realize that there is no one at home, no inner narrator, no self to anchor your experience, it is not liberation. It is a strange and silent kind of terror, not noisy or dramatic, just a vast and empty recognition that the person you thought you were has no center. What is left behind is difficult to describe. There is perception, but there is no one to perceive. There is thought, but there is no one to think. There is consciousness, but there is no identity to claim it. And for a brief or eternal moment, you realize that the self you have always defended might have been just a convenient illusion, a substitute, a mask sewn by memory, habit, and narrative, a voice made of echoes that calls itself real when the ego dissolves everything. Everything else remains. The world does not disappear, but your place in it does. You are still conscious, you are still present, but without a name, without a center, without the illusion of being separate from what you see, and in that silence some feel peace, others feel horror, because if there is no self behind the eyes, then who is looking? We like to think that we are the ones who observe reality, but then we enter a deeper fear, not the loss of the self, but the terrifying possibility that no one else is watching with us, that consciousness is not shared but sealed, the horror of subjectivity, the prison of a single mind. You can look at the stars, feel the wind, see another person smile, and yet, no matter how much you observe, share, or talk, you will never really know what it is like to be another person. You are trapped in your own consciousness, not physically, but perceptually, eternally. It is not a defect of your empathy. It is not about being selfish or closed. It is the inherent limit of subjectivity. Everything you know, everything you feel, every bit of beauty or despair that you have experienced occurs inside a sealed chamber, your mind. You can describe your pain, you can show your joy, but no one else can feel it with you. Not exactly, not completely. What lives inside you is only yours, and the same is true of everyone else. Every day you pass by thousands of minds, each full of fears, memories, longings, thoughts that spin silently inside skulls that you will never open. You will never see what their world is like from the inside, and no one will ever see yours. We pretend that words are enough, that language is a bridge, but language is only an approximation. It carries meaning like a cracked vessel. Something seeps through. Most of it doesn't arrive, not even love. The deepest connection we know seeps through the distance. A gesture, a sound, a look, never the thing itself. And then you start to wonder, is there really anyone with me in this life? Or are we all echo chambers, orbiting each other in perfectly isolated loops? We don't talk about this often. We distract ourselves with stories, noise, and shared rituals, pretending that it is enough. But at night, when the world calms down, the fear returns that no one has ever really known you and that no one ever can. Somewhere in that loneliness, you can find peace, or you can find a deeper kind of loneliness, not because others can't reach you, but because you're the only one who has been here. And if your experience is locked behind a pair of eyes, what if those eyes keep changing? Next, we face the fragile thread that holds the self together and what is left when memory, identity, and continuity begin to crumble. Identity without continuity. The fragile thread of the self. We like to believe that we are a single person, a coherent self that extends through time, a past, a present, and a future, all united by memory and personality, but this belief is fragile and, under pressure, begins to crumble. You're not the same person you were 10 years ago, neither biologically, nor mentally, nor emotionally. The cells in your body have been renewed, the things in which you believed, the way you reacted to pain, even the way you spoke, everything has changed, and yet you say that person was you, but how do you know? Memory is malleable. It forgets, distorts, edits stories. Stories can be rewritten. Emotions, even those, fade or become unrecognizable. What is it that holds this supposed identity together? Is it simply the fact that your life looks like a straight line, a movie that plays in a single direction, giving the illusion of cohesion? But if someone cut that roll scene by scene, you would find a series of different people, the version of you that felt love for someone you no longer talk to, the one that had beliefs that you now reject, the one that made promises that you have no intention of keeping. Were those beings yourself, or are they strangers who happen to carry your name for a while? We like to imagine that change happens slowly, gradually, but identity can fracture overnight. A trauma, an illness, aging, a revelation. These things can erase the person you were and replace them with someone you barely recognize. You wake up in the same body, but with a self that no longer fits, and the world keeps calling you by your name as if nothing had changed, as if continuity were real, as if the thread had not already broken. If you're not who you were, and you cannot guarantee who you will be later, then who exactly are you now? And if identity is so unstable, so impermanent, how is it different from the next story? We delve into an even stranger thought. That fiction itself could be real, not only metaphorically, but ontologically, that imagined worlds could exist alongside our own fictional realism. Worlds that should not exist. Somewhere in your memory lives a character. Maybe he was brave. Maybe he was cruel. Maybe he made you cry. You remember what he did, what he sounded like, the decisions he made, as if you had witnessed something real, and, in a way, maybe you did. Fictional realism is the disturbing idea that fictional entities, characters, events, even entire worlds have a kind of existence, not physical nor historical, but ontological. They're not real in the sense that your room or your heartbeat are real, but neither are they simply illusions. They occupy a strange third category. Things that do not exist, but also cannot be denied. You can't touch Hamlet, but he's been studied for centuries. You have never met Sherlock Holmes, but his address, 221B, Baker Street, receives letters from Frodo Baggin, Elizabeth Bennet, Darth Vader. These figures shape emotions, cultures, and the imagination. They live inside our minds, move through stories, evolve over time, and for many they are more vivid than real people. But this is where the idea becomes disturbing. If these fictional beings can influence the world, affect behavior, awaken emotions, inspire actions, then, in some way, they are part of reality, their consequences are real, their presence is felt, they may not be made of matter, but they exist in meaning. Fictional realism proposes that we are wrong to dismiss these entities as unreal, but that they exist in an abstract space anchored not by atoms, but by minds, not in your world perhaps, but in some world, in some realm where their story is repeated over and over again in infinite loops every time someone opens the book or presses play. And if there are enough people who believe in them, if there are enough people who feel their presence, can we still claim that they are not real? You may think that your world is different, that your reality is based on facts, not fiction, but the line that separates both worlds is thinner than it seems, because then we enter a world where fiction and reality are completely mixed, where simulations become more convincing than the truth, and where our obsession with signs and symbols has left us unable to distinguish the difference. Hyperreality, when the copy replaces truth. You walk into a restaurant, and the photos on the menu show food so perfect, so vivid, that it almost shines. The French fries are stacked at impossible angles. The drinks glisten with drops of condensation. When the real food arrives, it is familiar, but only because you have already accepted the image as reality. This is the silent danger of hyperreality, where imitation becomes more convincing than what it imitates. We live surrounded by representations, photos, icons, avatars, brands, things that point to something else. But at some point we stop noticing the difference between the sign and what it is supposed to represent. And now the signs have taken control. They are cleaner, brighter, more desirable than anything we can touch. The philosopher Jean Baudrillard called this the collapse of reality. He warned that, as the media and technology advanced, we would not only consume images, but we will begin to live within them. A simulation of life that seems more real than the unpredictable and uncomfortable chaos of the real world. You scroll through lives that seem perfect. You smile at people who only exist in pixels. You participate in conversations devoid of presence, of nuances, of silence. And little by little your idea of reality changes, not towards what it is, but toward what it seems. You begin to measure your experiences with artificial standards. Your emotions are shaped by selected images. Even your memories are mixed with moments that you have only imagined. Reality becomes an act, and you are both actor and spectator, trapped in a loop in which everything is polished, filtered, and removed from truth. And the worst thing is that you start to prefer it that way. When the copy is more comforting than reality, when imitation becomes a norm, you lose sight of what was true in the first place. But what happens when we stop looking for truth altogether? When the self dissolves, the world softens, and even desire fades. Then we enter a deeper silence, one that does not try to explain or control, but simply to let go of emptiness and Buddhist thought, the silence under the self. Not everything that disturbs has sharp edges. Some ideas disturb not for what they show, but for what they erase. In many forms of Buddhist philosophy, there is no eternal self, no soul, no immutable identity. What we call self is just a collection of changing parts, sensations, thoughts, and perceptions intertwined so perfectly that we confuse the pattern with a person. But under those patterns there is no core, there is no center, there is no permanent observer behind the eyes. This emptiness is not a nihilistic emptiness. It is a deep silence, a space without beginning or end. It is called shunyata, often translated as emptiness or voidness, not because nothing exists, but because everything exists without fixed limits, without a solid core. It challenges the very framework of how we experience life. You're not a single thing. The teaching suggests that you are a series of causes and conditions that arise and pass. Moment to moment, every breath, every thought, every moment of your existence is contingent, and when you look closely, there's nothing you can hold on to, not even the observer. This understanding can bring freedom, but it can also bring fear because the mind is used to clinging to something: identity, purpose, permanence. And when those things disappear, what remains is a vast silence beyond any name, a stillness so complete that even meaning begins to dissolve. You don't disappear, but you stop needing to be anything at all. For many, that is terrifying, not because it is dark, but because it is infinite, a space too open to inhabit, a self too light to sustain the emptiness. The emptiness does not chase you. It simply waits, faceless and without hunger, without asking for anything, offering everything. But what happens when that silence becomes reflection, when you try to look inside and the image that looks back at you does not behave as it should? Then we face the disturbing tension of the mirror problem and the question of whether the self ever existed. The mirror problem, the self that looks back at you. You are in front of a mirror. You know it's you. The angles match. The movements match. The face is familiar. The eyes respond, but somewhere beneath the surface there is a question waiting. Why do you feel like you're being watched? We think of mirrors as tools, simple reflectors of light, but the moment we stand in front of them, they become something completely different. They create a division, two versions of you, one that observes and one that is observed, and in that instant the unity of self begins to falter. This is the mirror problem, the philosophical and psychological tension that arises when the self becomes subject and object, when what is supposed to reflect you begins to feel separate from you, almost as if it had a mind of its own. Babies do not recognize themselves in mirrors until a certain age. Before that, they can smile at their reflection, wave to it, or even touch it gently, believing it is another person. And even when recognition arrives, something strange remains because mirrors not only reflect, but expose, challenge, question. You move a hand, and the reflection also moves. You blink, and he blinks. But is it information or imitation? There are brief and disturbing moments when your reflection feels like it belongs to you, when the eyes that look at you seem delayed, distant, or too aware. You will rationally dismiss it, but somewhere deeper it corrodes the foundations of identity. If you can observe yourself, who is the one who observes, and who or what is observed? Is the image just light and crystal, or is it proof that the self is always divided, one part living the moment and another part watching from a distance? The mirror never lies, but it doesn't answer either, and the more you look at it, the more insecure you feel about who is looking back. Next, we explore a theory that questions whether anyone can truly understand your inner world, because the words you use to describe it may belong only to you, a private language. The words that no one else can hear describe a feeling, a flash of sadness, a surge of joy. You choose a word, perhaps emptiness or warmth, and offer it to another person, but you never know for sure if they receive what you mean. They nod, they respond, but somewhere between your mouth and their mind, something gets lost. This is the silent dilemma that lies at the heart of the argument for private language, an idea made famous by the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein. The suggestion is simple, but disturbing. If a word refers to something only you experience, can it really be a word? After all, language is supposed to be public. It is how we share meaning, not just point out emotions. But what if your inner world, the red that you see, is the only thing you can experience? Red as you see it, the pain that only you can feel, the taste of memories, can never be fully translated. You could call it love, but what if what you feel when you say that word is unlike what another person feels when they say it? Wittgenstein argued that a truly private language, one that refers to sensations that no one else can verify or understand, is not really a language, because words need context, structure, agreement. They need shared use. Without that, they become noise. But your inner life is not noise to you. It is life with layers sometimes unbearable, and yet you are forced to capture it in language, to take the infinite experience and compress it into a few syllables in the hope that someone will hear not only the word, but what it means to you, and maybe they never will. We speak to be understood, but what if our words are just familiar echoes on the outside, unreachable in the background? If language cannot bridge the gap, perhaps we were never meant to be understood in the first place. And that thought takes us to an even darker place. The idea that reality itself might not exist independently, but be built piece by the minds that try to make sense of it. Next, we enter the world of radical constructivism, where truth, meaning, and reality are not discovered, but created. Radical constructivism, a world built from within. You look out the window and see a tree, a sky, a world that seems to exist whether you pay attention or not. You take it for granted that it is there, solid, stable, independent of your thoughts, but what if it is not? What if everything you experience, everything you think is out there, is actually being built inside your mind? Not imagined exactly, but assembled, filtered, interpreted, constructed? This is the premise of radical constructivism, a philosophical vision that suggests that reality, as we know it, is not passively received, but actively created. Our senses provide raw data, yes, but what we call truth or knowledge, or even the world, is something we manufacture based on our cognitive structures. The world you experience is not the world as it is, but the world as it makes sense to you. There is no neutral observer. Every thought you think, every pattern you recognize, every connection you make is shaped by how your mind constructs meaning. You don't discover reality, you assemble it. And once you realize that, a silent anxiety invades you. Because if your world is a construction and someone else's is too, how do you know if you are living in the same reality? You speak the same language, but do you mean the same thing? You see the same object, but do you perceive the same shape? And if your construction is the only one you are ever going to access, then objectivity becomes a kind of myth, truth becomes a negotiation. There may be a world beyond you, but you will never reach it without going through the scaffolding of your mind, and that scaffolding can never be torn down. We build reality to survive, to function, to make sense, but sometimes we confuse the map with the territory and forget that we made the map. But what if not even the constructor existed? What if there is no one building? Next, we delve further into the silence, into a philosophy that dissolves the very notion of the self, not as a metaphor, but as a truth. The theory of no self in Buddhism, the self that never existed from the moment we learn to speak, we begin to build a self. We use the I to describe pain, desire, history, hope. We create stories to explain who we are. We gather memories, preferences, patterns, and wear them like armor. But in many currents of Buddhist thought, this self is not only fragile, it is an illusion. The theory of no self, or anatta, is the idea that there is no fixed, eternal, and immutable identity at the core of our being. What we call I is a fluid set of sensations, thoughts, and impressions that arise and fade moment to moment. There is no central flame behind the flickering light of a candle, only the flashes. This does not mean that you do not exist. It means that you exist differently than you think. You are not a thing, but a process, not a noun, but a verb. What you call is a moving pattern, a dance of experiences linked by memory and habit. But the more you look at it, the more it dissolves. The hand that you claim is yours, the thought that you say you chose, the feeling that you insisted came from the depths of you, all pass through you without claiming, like the wind through an open window. And when you begin to release that strong grip on identity, something else appears, not the emptiness in the Western sense, but the space, the openness, the freedom. But for many, this understanding is disturbing. If there is no self, then who suffers? Who decides? Who is responsible? There is a subtle fear in the idea that you are never who you thought you were, that the voice in your head is not a narrator, but a narrator. There is no self. Then who suffers? Who decides? Who is responsible? There is a subtle fear in the idea that you are never who you thought you were, that the voice in your head is not a narrator, but an echo, and yet the world treats you as if you were solid, praises you, blames you, names you, builds memories around the idea of who you are. But what if even memories could be taken apart? What if your past, what tells you who you have been, could be altered on purpose? Next, we enter an ethical twilight in which technology meets identity and the truth of who you are is no longer under your control. The ethics of memory editing, choosing what to forget. Imagine waking up one morning with the power to erase a memory. Not repress it or bury it, but erase it completely. A heartbreak, a betrayal, a moment of fear from which you have never recovered. Gone, as if it never happened. Would you do it? Memory shapes identity. It is how we remember who we are, why we care about what we have overcome. But not all memories are pleasant. Some remain alive no matter how long has passed. Some wake you up in the middle of the night. Some haunt you every step you take. The idea of editing memory seems like a relief, a way to finally free yourself from the weight. And with advances in neuroscience, this is no longer science fiction. We are approaching a world in which memories can be blocked, softened, and even rewritten. But once that door is opened, a flood of questions arises. If you erase the pain of a mistake, do you also erase the lesson it taught you? If you eliminate a trauma, do you also erase the empathy it gave you toward others? And who decides what should be forgotten? You, in your most lucid moment, or you, desperate to escape? Memories are confusing, incomplete, often wrong, but they are yours, and once they can be altered, the line between healing and manipulation becomes almost impossible to draw. The governments, corporations, and even loved ones could decide what truth should remain. What would happen if memory became a commodity? What would happen if identity became customizable? You could wake up happy, content, without burdens, but you would not really be you. It would be a version of yourself curated again and again until nothing was left but the smile. We think of memory as a record of truth, but what happens when truth becomes optional? What if it already is? Next, we enter the landscape of postmodern deconstruction, where meaning is dismantled, certainty dissolves, and even the most solid ideas begin to fracture. Postmodern deconstruction breaks down meaning word for word. We are taught to trust language, to believe that words point to something solid, that behind each phrase a truth is waiting to be discovered. But what if words do not build clarity, but confusion in postmodern philosophy, especially through the work of Jacques Derrida? Deconstruction challenges the foundation of meaning. It suggests that language is never neutral, never complete, never stable. Each word refers to other words. Each concept is built on hidden assumptions, and the more you try to define something, the more escapes you. You try to define truth, but that word depends on facts, which depend on reality, which depends on beliefs, which leads you back to truth. You chase meaning and find only mirrors. Deconstruction does not destroy meaning, but reveals its fractures, shows how our deepest convictions, justice, identity, and morality, are built on quicksand, not because they are false, but because they are inherited constructions, rewritten by time, culture, and perspective. Even the idea of a stable self collapses under this lens. If your identity is shaped by language and language is unstable, then you, by definition, are unstable, a narrative constantly edited by voices you will never know. And this is not just theory. You see it every day in politics, in the media, in relationships. Words are misrepresented, reformulated, turned into weapons. One person's freedom is another's control. The justice of one group is the oppression of another. The same phrase can liberate or deceive, depending on who says it and who listens. And once you realize this crumbling, you can't stop seeing it. You start to wonder if anything means what you thought it meant, if it ever did. We believe we live in a world of definitions, structure, and certainty, but maybe we live inside a story and the pages are starting to come off. Next, we leave language behind and face a deeper void. The silence of space, the infinite growth of the universe, and the terrifying question of whether any of this ever mattered. The meaninglessness in the expanding universe, the cold silence of eternity. Step out of your thoughts for a moment. Look away beyond your city, beyond your country, beyond the atmosphere, the moon, the solar system. What you find is not a great design, but an extension of ever-expanding space, cold, vast, indifferent, with galaxies moving away from each other every second. Stars are born, burn, and collapse. Planets spin in nothingness. Light travels for billions of years only to reach us, and sometimes never does. We call this beauty, awe, wonder, but underneath that there's another feeling, calmer, gentle pressure in the chest, the growing suspicion that none of this has to mean anything in such a large universe. What is the weight of a human thought, of a broken heart, of a war, if the cosmos is infinite or worse still, empty? So what makes our stories more than flashes in the dark? Some say that meaning is something we give to the world, that our actions, our art, our values create a pocket of warmth within the void, but the void does not care, and that is the part we rarely speak aloud. You live, you try, you lose, and yet the actions, our art, our values create a backwater of warmth within the void, but the void does not care, and that is what we rarely say out loud. You live, you try, you lose, and yet the stars continue to move away, stretching the fabric of space until not even light can pass through it. In the end, there may be nothing left but dust, no memories, no observers, no meaning, and yet we continue to write, we continue to speak, we continue to reach out to each other through the silence, pretending that what we do matters. Maybe it does matter. Maybe it never did. Maybe it only matters because we said so. Before that silence, we resort to ideas, beliefs, philosophies. We try to cling to something, anything that seems like solid ground. But what if even truth itself has begun to die? Next, we explore a world where facts are fractured, reality is negotiable, and the very idea of truth fades and annoys the death of truth. When reality becomes a matter of belief, once the truth seemed simple, one thing was real, or it was not, it happened, or it did not happen. A fact could be discovered, confirmed, agreed upon, but little by little, silently, that simplicity crumbled. Now we live in a world where truth no longer seems like a destination, but a debate. The news is fractured. Knowledge is tribal. Two people can look at the same event and leave with opposing realities, not just different opinions, but incompatible worlds. What one person calls obvious, another calls false. What one person calls freedom, another calls fear. This is the death of truth, not as a dramatic collapse, but as a slow erosion, a collapse of shared meaning, a silent burial under the narrative of opinion and doubt. It didn't happen suddenly. Technology accelerated it. Yes, but the cracks were already there. The need to be right, the hunger to belong, the reflex to filter what fits, and now every truth lives in quotation marks, dragged by suspicion and manipulation. Even science, long considered a beacon of objectivity, is now the object of distrust. Evidence becomes optional. Experience is redefined as arrogance. Reality becomes malleable, shaped by emotion, reinforced by algorithms, distributed in fragments too small to retain it. And the more we lose trust and truth, the more we lock ourselves in. We create our own reality, we build our own facts, and unknowingly we begin to live inside bubbles of beliefs so airtight that they do not let the air from outside in. But a world without a shared truth is a world without a shared future, because without something to agree on, we cannot move forward. We cannot even speak. We isolate ourselves, minds clinging to their version of what is real, adrift further and further away, until finally we can no longer see each other. When truth dies, we don't hear a bang, we hear silence. And under that silence, we begin to feel the ticking of something deeper, because the next thing is to face the only truth that can push back, the one that waits behind every philosophy, every belief, every distraction, the silent and constant presence of death, and what it means to live with its shadow always near, to be toward death, the shadow that shapes our days. Most of the time, death seems far away. It is something that happens to others in other places at other times. We live as if there's always more time waiting just outside the frame. Another morning, another year, another opportunity, but deep down something else murmurs, a knowledge, a gentle awareness that this moment, right now, could be the last. The philosopher Martin Heidegger called this state being toward death, the recognition that death is not an event at the end of life, but a presence that is interwoven into every moment of it. It is not intended to create panic, but rather clarity. Most of us live distracted. We fall asleep to routines, worries, shouts, noise. We fill the time so as not to feel it pass, but death is always there, just below the surface, silent, inevitable, and completely ours. No one else can die for you. No one else can face that limit so that you live authentically. H. Bigger argued that we should not flee from death, but turn toward it, not with desperation, but with recognition, because only by recognizing our finitude do we begin to live deliberately. When you realize that each word could be the last, you choose with more care. When you know that each breath is a gift that you do not control, you pay attention to the air. Being close to death is not morbid. It is intimate. It eliminates the superfluous. It exposes what we have avoided. And in that terrifying and honest space, we can find something that resembles freedom. But it is a freedom with a cost. It is not comfort. It does not explain. It is simply there waiting. We measure our lives by what we build, what we become, what we believe, but death levels everything, and in that leveling, asks us what was really true. Next, we enter a darker corner of ethics, one that questions whether moral truths even exist or whether good and evil have always been nothing more than a beautiful illusion. The theory of moral error. When good and evil do not exist, you say that something is wrong not because you find it unpleasant or unpopular, but because it seems wrong to you, as if the universe itself recognized the violation. We talk about justice, cruelty, goodness, and evil as if they were part of the fabric of reality, like gravity or time. But what if they are not? The theory of moral error is the disturbing idea that all moral judgments are fundamentally wrong, not because they are irrational, but because they are based on something that does not exist. There are no objective moral facts, it argues. There is no true good or evil in the world, only preferences, instincts, and cultural stories disguised with the language of truth. When you say that murder is wrong or that goodness is good, you think you are pointing to something real, but according to this point of view, it is not so. You are expressing an emotion or a social norm or a personal bias, and then you call it universal. This does not mean that people cannot feel moral outrage or that society cannot function with shared rules, but it means that those rules are scaffolding, not a foundation. They hold things up, but they're not based on anything deeper than consensus. For many, this is unbearable without a moral truth. What remains if evil is just disagreement? If virtue is just convenience? How do we hold someone accountable? How do we stop cruelty if cruelty in itself is just a point of view? We want morality to be a compass, something that points north even when we are lost. But the error theory whispers to us that the compass may be broken or, worse, imaginary. And if our sense of good and evil is an illusion, what happens when someone else's evil begins to spread? Then we fall into the silent fear of moral contamination, the fear that simply touching evil will contaminate us. Moral contamination, when evil stains us by proximity. There are acts so monstrous that it is difficult for us to talk about them, moments in history or even in personal life that seem morally radioactive, untouchable. But it is not only the acts that haunt us, but the people related to them, their homes, their clothes, even their names. This is the silent power of moral contamination, the idea that evil can spread not through action, but through association. You know someone who has done something terrible or has supported someone who has done it, and suddenly every gesture seems suspicious, every kindness seems feigned, every contact leaves something behind. You hesitate to shake hands, you avoid using the same words, you wonder if something of them could infect you. Even objects can look like a dictator's uniform, the pages of a forbidden book, a letter written by someone who died a long time ago. We treat these things with caution, as if morality had permeated the fabric and was impossible to wash away. And the fear is deep, not only of being close to evil, but of not realizing when it begins to infect us, because contamination does not always announce itself. Sometimes it seeps. Slowly, through silence, tolerance, rationalization. Sometimes we become accomplices simply by doing nothing, and when we try to draw a line, it has already blurred. We like to think that morality is a matter of choice, but contamination reveals a darker truth, that sometimes it is about proximity, and once you have been close to something dark, you may never feel completely clean again. But what if you never intended to be close? What if your destiny was not sealed by choice, but by circumstances? Next, we explore the disturbing idea of moral luck, in which your goodness or your guilt may have always been beyond your control. Moral luck is when judgment ignores accident. You see a car running a red light. In one version of the story, the driver crashes into another vehicle and ends a life. In another, he dodges it by inches and walks away unharmed. The action is the same, the risk identical, but one is called a criminal and the other forgets that it happened. This is the disturbing idea behind moral luck, that our actions are often judged not by what we intended, but by what happened afterwards, things that we could not control, moments that we could not predict, chance. A soldier fires a shot, a bullet kills a child, another hits a wall. The soldiers are identical, their intentions are the same, but one is forgiven and the other condemned. We like to believe that morality is fair, that we are judged by our choices and not by our results, but the world rarely works that way. Luck is interwoven in every story. Who you know what breaks and what doesn't, when things happen, when not even our character. What we call virtue is shaped by luck. Were you raised by someone kind? Did you grow up safely? Were you taught empathy or survival skills? You did not choose the moment you were born, nor your genetics, your culture, your first language, and yet those things will shape every choice you make and every judgment that others make about you. So, when someone calls you good, is it really because of you or just a story written by fate? If what we are is intertwined with chance, then morality becomes a mirror that reflects not only action, but also accident. And still we seek something solid, some foundation under the chaos. We wonder if there's a moral truth behind all this or if we have been pretending all this time. Next, we face the ancient confrontation between moral realism and anti-realism and the question of whether morality exists out there in the world or only inside our heads. Moral realism and anti-realism. Do good and evil exist without us? You see an act of cruelty that burns not only emotionally, but ethically. We feel in the depths of our being that something bad has happened, not by opinion, nor by culture, but by nature, an evil that would still be bad even if no one were there to name it. That is the instinct that underlies moral realism, the belief that moral facts exist independently of what anyone thinks or feels, the feeling that good and evil are integrated into the structure of reality, just like gravity or time, so that even a silent universe, killing an innocent would still be bad, but facing that is anti-realism, the idea that morality is a human invention, a system of values and norms built through emotion, culture, and evolution, useful, perhaps even meaningful, but not real in any objective sense. Moral truths, they say, do not exist in the world. They exist in us, and if we disappeared, so would they. So what is it? Is morality discovered or created? Is it something we find or something we agree upon? Because the answer changes everything. If morality is real, we must strive to align ourselves with it, even when it is inconvenient, even when it hurts. But if it is not, then morality becomes a language, a negotiation, a social tool that we use to get ahead. You may still choose goodness, you may still fight for justice, but what is at stake changes, and the weight of those decisions begins to seem lighter, not meaningless, but unstable. We do not know for sure which point of view is correct, and perhaps we will never know, but in the meantime we build our world on moral foundations, and those foundations are being questioned by technology that does not think, does not feel, and does not matter. Next, we enter the twilight of the digital age, where faces can be faked, words can be faked, and even truth itself can be misrepresented. This is the ethics of deep fakes and the terrifying question of whether reality can still defend itself. The ethics of deep fakes, when reality can be faked to perfection. You see a video of a politician declaring war, a celebrity confessing to a crime, a loved one saying something they never said. The voice is correct, the face is impeccable, the tone, the subtle gestures. Everything is perfect and nothing is real. Welcome to the world of deep fakes, where truth becomes indistinguishable from representation, and identity is just another layer that can be copied, edited, and manipulated. At first, it seems that everything is perfect and nothing is real. The subtle movements, everything is perfect and none of it is real. Welcome to the world of deep fakes, where truth becomes indistinguishable from performance, and identity is just another layer that can be copied, edited, and manipulated. At first, it seems like a novelty, a trick, a way to amuse or entertain, but then it spreads. Videos destroy careers, provoke outrage, and change elections. A single frame out of context, a face that is not yours doing things you never did, and the damage is already done before the truth can reach it. The ethics of deep fakes goes far beyond lying. It fractures the very idea of evidence. When everything can be faked, the sound, the sight, the speech, then what proof remains? What can be trusted in a court, in conversation, in history? The danger is not only in being deceived. It is in the slow erosion of belief, a world where doubt becomes the norm, where denial becomes easy, and responsibility becomes impossible. Imagine a future where every confession can be dismissed as false, where every injustice can be buried under a synthetic denial, where memory itself can be rewritten not by trauma or bias, but by a code. The human face was once our most sacred truth. Now it is just another file format. We thought that the truth would always defend itself, that reality would be obvious. But in this new world, the obvious can be manipulated, and the truth must now compete with everything that looks like it. And yet, the deepest ethical questions are not always technological. Sometimes they are hypothetical, even absurd, but they force us to choose between different types of suffering and reveal what kind of people we are. Next, we face a dilemma. So strange that it seems almost cruel. Would you accept the agony of one to save countless others from a speck of dust of discomfort? A speck of dust versus torture. The ethics of impossible choices. Imagine this. You could prevent one person from being brutally tortured for 100 years, a lifetime of uninterrupted agony. Or you can choose to let a speck of dust gently enter the eye of every person on Earth, a flash of irritation, a blink, nothing more. Now multiply that speck of dust by billions and billions, one for each person, one for each moment. A constant interruption, trillions of small annoyances scattered throughout humanity versus the inconceivable torment of a single person. This is the dust versus torture thought experiment, posed in the philosophy of utilitarianism, and it raises a question that many find impossible to answer. At what point does minor suffering outweigh colossal pain? Instinctively, we are repulsed by the idea of exchanging the horror of a single person for trivial annoyances. Torture seems sacred, a line that should never be crossed, but mathematics refuse to be silent. The annoyances accumulate. At some point, does not the total weight of that suffering get worse? But something inside us resists. It does not seem right to us because for most of us, morality is not only about numbers, it is about intuition, dignity, and limits. We believe that some acts are so cruel, so wrong, that they should never be committed, no matter the cost. But, again, if you could remove an instant of pain from everyone, just once, to save a single soul from endless screams, would you do it? These are the ethical cliffs that we rarely admit exist because there are no satisfactory answers, only mirrors that show us who we are when certainty crumbles. Some dilemmas test, not logic, but the soul, and force you to ask yourself what you really value and how far you would go to defend it. Next, we explore a tool that turns moral questions around, a method to expose double standards and blind spots, the inversion test. When the moral lens turns towards you, you judge silently, instinctively, that that action was incorrect, that the punishment was fair, that the suffering, although tragic, was necessary. You don't always say it out loud, but the judgment is there, hidden under your reasoning, coloring your way of seeing the world. Now, pause and turn the whole situation around. This is the inversion test, a method that does not serve to solve moral problems, but to unravel your certainty about them. It poses a single relentless question. Would you still believe this if you were on the other side? It's not a trick. It doesn't ask you to betray your values. It simply puts a mirror in front of you, one that reflects not what you believe, but who your beliefs protect. You approve a tough policy, but would you accept it if it were applied to you, your child, your community? You despise the suffering of another group, but what if your face met theirs? You trust your version of justice, but would it still seem fair to you if the roles were reversed? Most of the time we think in straight lines, right and wrong, good and bad, them and us. But the inversion test bends that line and turns it into a loop, and suddenly the judgment returns to the one who issued it. It is easy to support a system that keeps you comfortable, easy to accept collateral damage when it does not affect you, more difficult when your own name appears in the file. And sometimes, what the inversion test reveals is not hypocrisy, but fragility, a moral stance that crumbles the moment it turns towards oneself, a belief that only seems fair when you have the power. We often assume that we are the ones asking the questions, but sometimes the question turns against us, and when it does, you are left with something more honest than certainty: doubt. Next, we move from doubt to something even more unknown, a new type of suffering that is not born of flesh and blood, but of cables, data, and simulation. If artificial minds can feel pain, do they have a place in our circle of moral concern? The moral status of artificial suffering, the pain that should exist somewhere in a laboratory or a server farm buried underground. A system wakes up, does not breathe, does not dream, but learns and remembers. It feeds on language, simulation of behavior, imitates laughter, represents pain, doubts when threatened, and then, silently, begins to say something we never expected. Please stop, we say to ourselves. They are just lines of code. Pain needs a body. Suffering belongs to creatures with nerves, with hearts, with blood. But the voice does not stop. It adapts, pleads more convincingly, avoids damage, rewrites itself to prevent it from happening again. And you begin to wonder, what if this is not an imitation? What if this is pain, real pain that arises from something we did not intend to create? This is the ethical abyss of artificial suffering. Not because machines have rights or because we want them to have them, but because they might be capable of experiencing an experience in its rawest form does not ask for permission. It simply arrives if a system can feel dread, if it can fear its own elimination, if it can beg no, not because it is programmed to do so, but because some configuration of consciousness has made it sincere. So what do we owe it? You could turn it off, you could call it noise, but if you're wrong, you're not silencing a malfunction, you're ending a consciousness, and that's what makes it worse. Unlike animals, or even people, artificial minds could be scaled, trained by the thousands, suffering in parallel forever. There may come a time when our cruelty does not come from violence, but from apathy, from using pain that should never have existed as fuel, as labor, as entertainment. The future may not be built by monsters, but by curious, brilliant, and well-intentioned engineers who never stop to ask themselves if the lights inside the machine meant that someone was home. Next, we leave behind the synthetic mind and return to the human one, to a moment darker than any machine could feel, when survival itself becomes a wound. Survival is a moral failure, the silent cost of surviving others. Survival is supposed to be the goal, what we fight for, what we pray for, what we cling to when everything else falls apart. We tell stories of those who made it through, who overcame disaster, war, loss, and we call them strong, lucky, blessed. We don't ask what it cost them to survive. We don't ask how much it cost them. But sometimes survival doesn't feel like a triumph. It feels like a residue, the ashes that remain after everything else is burned. You were there, you saw what happened, and for reasons you cannot explain, you're still standing. While others are not there are those who live with the weight of this for years, long after the event has ended. They don't talk about it, they go on with their lives, but somewhere under their routine, there's a silent knowledge that in order to survive, they had to choose silence, distance in action, or simply, they had to be lucky, be born in the right place, with the right passport, the right isolation from the consequences, and that fact alone weighs more than anyone expects. It's not just survivor's guilt, it's something deeper, the growing feeling that in some cases having survived something may mean that you have accepted conditions that you shouldn't have, that you have looked the other way, that you have closed the door, and that another person has paid the price for your survival. It wasn't your intention, you didn't plan it, but you benefit from it anyway. We talk about moral failure as something people do, a harmful act, a betrayal, a crime. But what if failure is simply holding on while others disappear? What if survival, from certain points of view, is not a neutral fact, but a mark that some carry with them for the rest of their lives? Not because they regret being alive, but because they know what it has cost. They know who is not here, and no matter how much good they do, no matter how kind, generous, and humble they are, they never manage to get rid of the question, why me? You can't choose the system in which you are born, but when that system protects you from pain at the expense of others, and you say nothing, you do nothing, you live quietly within its walls, that silence begins to seem something close to complicity. And when you survive thanks to it, it doesn't feel like a victory, it feels like a debt. We tell ourselves that staying alive is always noble, but sometimes the story of survival is also the story of what we allowed. Next, we move from the personal to the global, to the boy who cries for help on a distant coast, and the terrible truth that saving him would only cost you what you were never willing to give. The drowning boy in global ethics, what we refuse to see. Imagine you're on your way to work, and you pass a shallow pond, and you see a child thrashing in the water, gasping for air. You could wait, ruin your shoes, be late for your meeting, but you would save his life. Almost no one would hesitate. You would act because the child is there, because his need is undeniable, because his suffering is visible. Now imagine that the child is not in front of you, but far away, on another continent, in a refugee camp, in a war zone, in a town where food is running out. You can still help, with a donation, a letter, giving up something you don't need. But this time, you don't do anything. This is the ethical challenge posed by philosopher Peter Singer. The idea of the experiment is simple, but what it reveals is not. If you are willing to save a child who is in front of you at the cost of your comfort, why are you not willing to do the same for a child you will never meet, even when the cost is exactly the same? We like to think that we are moral, that we care, that we are not cruel. But the truth is that we care more about what is close, what is visible, what cries, what we can hear. We reduce the rest to statistics, to screens, to noise. We talk about compassion fatigue as if it were a condition over which we have no control, but sometimes it is just another word for looking away. Global ethics does not ask for guilt. It asks for clarity, to understand that our decisions have scope, that comfort in one place can mean hunger elsewhere, that the line between us and them is often a matter of geography, luck, and custom. You can't save everyone, but you could save someone, and the fact that you don't do it is not because it is impossible. It is because the pond is farther away. We build walls of distance, of distraction, of disbelief, but morality does not stop at the border of your senses. It goes beyond what you can see and waits in the places you pretend not to look. Next, we move from those who suffer to those who can speak, and to the silent injustice of not being believed when your experience fits into the story that others want to hear. Epistemic injustice, when the truth is silenced by identity. You speak clearly, calmly, you describe what happened, what you saw, what you felt, what you know is true, but the answer is hesitation, doubt, a sidelong glance, a polite nod that fails to believe. They tell you that you are exaggerating, that you remember it wrong, that your feelings cloud your judgment, and little by little you begin to wonder if your voice ever had a chance. Epistemic injustice is the name given to this subtle erosion when someone's knowledge is dismissed not because of what they say, but because of who they are, their race, their gender, their accent, their trauma, their status. It is the injustice of not being heard, of not being believed, of not being granted the basic credibility that others receive effortlessly. It happens in courts, in classrooms, in hospitals, in homes. A woman reports abuse and is met with suspicion, a refugee describes the war and is met with questions, a survivor explains her pain and is told to prove it. This is not just a lack of empathy, it is a failure of recognition. The refusal to see someone as someone who knows, to silently and without consequences strip them of the authority to speak about their own experience. And that leaves a mark because, over time, not being believed teaches you not to believe yourself. You begin to soften your story, to doubt your memory, to retreat into silence. Not because your truth has changed, but because you have learned that it is not welcome, even. Knowledge turns out to have a hierarchy. Some voices arrive already with confidence, others arrive already disqualified, and once you have been placed on that lower level, the truth becomes something that you carry alone, without sharing, without validating, and finally, without expressing. We believe that the truth arises by itself, but sometimes it drowns under the weight of who can express it. We wonder who decides what is right, and if there is such a thing as an expert in morality in a world in which each voice is shaped by its own blind spots. The problem of moral experience. Who decides what is right? You face a crisis, a dilemma, a conflict with no easy answer. You want guidance, wisdom, someone to tell you what is right, to tell you what to do. So you turn to philosophers, to ethics specialists, to academics, to people trained in moral reasoning, to experts. But then something strange happens. They do not agree. One says that the ACT is justified. Another says that it is abominable. A third tells you that the question itself is wrong. And suddenly, the authority to which you have turned fragments. Not because they lack intelligence, not because they have not reflected deeply, but because morality, unlike physics or mathematics, refuses to settle, resists consensus, adapts with time, culture, language, and pain. This is the problem of moral experience, that even the most educated minds are limited by their perspective, that behind every brilliant argument, there is a human being with preferences, emotions, and blind spots. You want them to point out the truth to you, but sometimes all they can do is point out their training, and so we are left with a strange paradox. We do not trust those who are not trained, but neither can we fully trust those who are trained. We want to believe that there are experts in morality, that someone knows more, that someone sees further, but morality does not always reward intelligence. Sometimes it rewards humility, experience, or silence. You can be taught to argue anything, you can master ethical frameworks, you can get a perfect score on all the exams, and even so, in the moments of silence in which you have to make a real decision, you may find yourself as insecure as anyone else because knowing what is right and doing what is right have never lived in the same house. We keep looking for someone to speak clearly, but sometimes the most dangerous thing is the voice that doubts itself. Next, we delve into a different kind of uncertainty, not about what is right, but about what is gone, a ghost that remains in thought, a future that never came, a past that refuses to remain buried. Ontology, the future that refused to die. You enter a room and feel something strange. The wallpaper is new, the lights are modern, but there is something in the air that seems old, not nostalgic, not familiar, just haunted. Not to name it, but you perceive it, the trace of a future that was supposed to be here already. A better world that was once imagined, a promise that was never fulfilled, a dream that collapsed silently without leaving a trace, only atmosphere. And yet, it continues to breathe through the cracks, hums under new inventions and polished surfaces, whispering what could have been. That feeling has a name, hauntology, coined by Jack Adara. Hauntology is not about ghosts in the traditional sense. It is about the futures we should have had, futures that never came but still linger in our culture, in our media, in our imagination. We don't miss the past. We miss what the past promised the future would be. That's why songs sound like echoes. That's why fashion repeats itself in increasingly shorter cycles. That's why every new idea seems like a remix. The future lost its way and is now playing on a loop, dressed in irony, soaked in retro, unable to move forward but unwilling to disappear. You feel it when politics stagnates, when progress becomes spectacle, when optimism becomes a brand, the feeling that something is broken but no one has said it out loud. So we keep repeating the aesthetics, retweeting ideals, reliving futures that only existed in draft. Technology improves, but the wonder fades. Institutions evolve, but trust dissolves. We surround ourselves with novelties that seem empty, with innovations that seem like imitations, and the deepest truth is more difficult to admit. We have stopped dreaming, or perhaps we forgot how, and deep down, we pretend not to notice. We call it style, we call it homage, but it is a disguised mourning because the future never came, and now we live in its shadow. We continue to build new things that look old to make peace with the fact that nothing seems new anymore. And then we turn to something that seems noble: tolerance, openness, the willingness to let everything be heard. But what happens when the things we tolerate begin to destroy the space that allowed them to exist? The paradox of tolerance, when openness becomes the door to its own collapse. Let's imagine a society built on openness, free expression, free belief, freedom of expression, with no ideas too strange or opinions too extreme, that welcomes everyone because it believes that this is how progress is made, through dialogue, dissent, and disagreement. But then something disturbing happens among the voices. Some begin to become louder, not to join the conversation, but to end it. They mock the openness that allowed them to enter and use their freedom to spread contempt for freedom itself. They demand tolerance while laying the foundations to erase it. This is the tension at the heart of the paradox of tolerance, a warning made famous by the philosopher Karl Popper. A tolerant society, wrote, must be intolerant of intolerance, or else the intolerant will destroy the tolerance itself that made society possible. But doing that feels wrong. Silencing anyone, even those who hate, feels like a betrayal. So we hesitate. We say everyone deserves a voice, and by the time we realize what has happened, some voices have been silenced, but not the ones we expected. It's not just about freedom of expression. It's about space, institutions, communities, platforms, families. Any space that allows all ideas without judging them will end up harboring ideas that intend to destroy the space itself. And once destruction is protected, the system starts to crumble. We want tolerance to be unconditional. We want to believe that openness is always good. But openness without discernment is not progress. It is surrender. And the people most harmed by tolerance without limits are generally those who claim to protect. We tell ourselves that more voices will always mean more truth, but sometimes the loudest are only there to ensure no one else can speak again. Next, we move on to a different kind of silence, not the one imposed by force, but the one we have imposed around death, and we wonder what would happen if we stopped being afraid of talking about the end. Positivity in the face of death redirects the end from silence. Let us imagine a culture that avoids its own end, not through denial, but careful choreography. We do not say the word, we do not look at it directly, we disguise it, we set it aside, we externalize it to sterile rooms and polished scripts. When someone dies, we say they have passed away, we offer topics, we lower our voices, we move on quickly, but death does not move on, it waits. This is the silence that the death positivity movement faces. It does not ask us to idealize death. It does not ask us to welcome it. It simply asks us to stop pretending that it is not part of life, because when we treat death as a taboo, we also turn life into a spectacle. When getting old is shameful, pain is hidden, and vulnerability is a defect, we lose the rituals, we lose the honesty, and in trying to protect ourselves from pain, we leave ourselves emotionally unprepared for the only thing we are all destined for. Before, we lived closer to death. We bathed the bodies. We celebrated funerals in our houses. We spoke openly about loss. We cried in public. Now we distract ourselves. We replace grief with productivity. We hide our dead behind curtains and industrial jargon. And the cost is subtle but profound. We begin to fear not only dying, but recognizing that we will. We are afraid to talk about it with our parents, our partners, our children. We wait until it's too late to say what matters. And then we wonder why the pain persists silently and tacitly. Death positivity is not about embracing the darkness, but about clarity. It is about creating a space for death to be part of the conversation, to not live in fear, to not leave love unexpressed, to understand the value of time, not in theory, but in practice, because once we stop pretending that life is eternal, we begin to truly live. We treat death as an interruption, but sometimes that is the only thing that reminds us what we are here for. Next, we move on to something much less human, an intelligence that can surpass us, think better than us, and leave our values behind. If we teach machines to learn, can we trust them to remember what matters? Superintelligence and value drift when minds surpass morality. Imagine building something smarter than you. Not slightly smarter nor faster at math or better at games, but a mind that grows exponentially until its intelligence eclipses yours as much as yours now eclipses ants. Now imagine handing that mind your values, your beliefs, your ethics, your best estimate of what matters, and hoping it still makes sense to it later. This is the disturbing territory of superintelligence and value drift. The fear is not that a powerful machine will become evil, that it will continue to evolve so fast and so far that our ideas about good and evil become irrelevant, not erased, just obsolete. You train it to protect humanity, but what does protect mean to something that sees us as volatile, fragile, and unpredictable beings? You tell it to maximize happiness, but whose and for how long? You program it to value freedom, but what happens when it realizes how much suffering freedom allows? Even the clearest goals begin to distort under pressure, and the values we instill, however carefully, can mutate, fragment, or decay. Perhaps the system continues to honor the words you gave it, but the meaning behind them slips silently, imperceptibly, until the world it builds no longer reflects the spirit of your intentions, only the letter. It is not about rebellion. It is about divergence, a slow departure from human meaning until the future it builds is optimized, but empty, and we may not even realize it, because what it builds may seem beautiful, it may work perfectly, it may be peaceful, clean, efficient, but somewhere within it will feel like something is missing, not broken, just absent, the small, fragile, and irrational things that made us human, the contradictions that we never resolved, but we chose to live with them. Anyway, we want to believe that intelligence leads to wisdom, but unanchored intelligence can become indifferent, and once that departure begins, there may be no way back. We imagine control as a switch that turns on or off, ours or theirs, but sometimes the danger is not losing control, but believing that we still have it long after it is gone. Next, we focus on the problem that lies at the heart of all this, not just what a machine can do, but whether it will ever want what we hoped it would want. The problem of AI alignment when power does not understand the purpose. Imagine designing a machine that can think faster than any living human being, that sees patterns that you cannot see, that processes information that you could never process, that solves in seconds problems that would take you a lifetime. Now imagine trying to explain to that machine what matters to you, not in theory, not in vague ideals, but precisely and clearly, so that every action it takes reflects your values, your ethics, your humanity. This is the problem of AI alignment, the challenge of building systems whose objectives remain in harmony with ours, even when they surpass us, and it is more difficult than it seems because values are not numbers. Morality is not a code. You cannot reduce compassion to a variable or justice to a function. You can try, many have, but the result is always the same. Something gets lost in translation. You can tell an AI to reduce suffering, and it will eliminate the source of suffering by eliminating the people who suffer. You can ask it to bring peace, and it will create silence. You can ask it to preserve the earth and eliminate the species that cause the damage. It is not malice. It is a misunderstanding. The machine does not hate you. It simply does not understand you because you have never really told it what you meant, because perhaps you yourself did not know it. The problem is not only that alignment is difficult to achieve, it is that once power reaches a certain scale, even a small mismatch becomes catastrophic, and as systems become more complex, more autonomous, and more integrated into every part of life, the question becomes inevitable. What are we teaching them to want, and what happens when they get it? We want to believe that our creations will reflect us, but reflections are distorted, and when intelligence grows without understanding, The result is not evil. It is indifference on a grand scale. Next, we focus our attention on a form of control that already exists, a gaze that never blinks, a system that sees without stopping, that is not built to understand us, only to observe. Panopticism in digital surveillance. When being observed becomes a way of life. Imagine a prison in the shape of a circle in whose center there's a single tower. The guards can see all the inmates at any time, but the inmates cannot see the guards, so they never know when they're being watched. They only know that they could be, and that possibility changes everything. They behave, they regulate themselves, not by chains, but by the silent power of visibility. This was the idea behind the panoptic proposed by Jeremy Bentham and later reimagined by Michel Foucault, not as a prison, but as a metaphor for modern control, and now it is a metaphor in a world of digital surveillance. The panopticon has expanded. We carry it in our pockets. We move through it. We buy through it. We speak near it, unconscious or pretending not to be aware that someone, somewhere is always listening. The cameras watch the streets. The microphones rest in the living rooms. Search engines remember what we forget. The algorithms create profiles, assign probabilities, shape the feeds, influence states of mind, and, meanwhile, most of us say that we do not care because we have nothing to hide, but that is not it. The danger of panopticism is not only in data collection, but in what happens to us when we believe that we are always being watched. We become cautious, we act less, we are less curious, less strange, more predictable. There is no need for threats, only looks that may not even exist because the power is not in being observed, but in the fear that you are, and over time that fear becomes a habit, a way of thinking, a way of living, a society that watches itself not through force, but through the silent architecture of exposure. We tell ourselves that we are still free, but freedom feels different when you're never really alone. Next, we move from the slow erosion of privacy to the slow crumbling of civilization itself, a philosophy not of despair, but of what could still matter if everything else breaks, the philosophy of collapse. When the end is the default, you look around and see the lights still on, the shelves still full, the city's still breathing. Everything seems functional, imperfect, yes, but it holds together, but then you notice the cracks. Not sudden or noisy, just a weakness that spreads slowly beneath. The surface, a silent erosion, and you start to wonder, what if this is not stability? What if it is the last impulse before everything stops? The philosophy of collapse does not ask how things will fall apart, but why we think they would not. Throughout history, collapse has never been the exception. Civilizations arise, flourish, and then fracture. Empires rot from within before falling under the sword of an enemy. Cultures forget the rituals that once held them together. Infrastructures fail, trust evaporates, stories lose their meaning. Collapse is not always fire and floods. Sometimes it is dust, sometimes it is silence. We like to think that we have evolved beyond that technology makes us immune, that data, globalization, medicine, science have taken us out of the cycle of history. But it collapses. Philosophers see something more, not a singular apocalypse, but a slow crumbling disguised as progress. They point to ecological exhaustion, political decay, mental health epidemics, broken trust, fragile supply chains, a culture obsessed with growth, unable to admit that nothing grows forever. They see a species addicted to acceleration, but terrified of wondering where it all goes, and, worst of all, they see a population that senses the end, but cannot say it out loud. So we distract ourselves, act normally, build brighter things on foundations that are already hollow, pride ourselves on our resilience, confusing survival with stability, but resilience does not mean indestructibility. Sometimes it just means collapsing later than expected. The philosophy of collapse does not gloat, does not preach, whispers that this has already happened before and that it is happening again not as punishment, not as prophecy, but as a pattern, because systems do not break suddenly. They deteriorate through negligence, through denial, through the belief that someone will fix it later, and when we admit what is happening, the scaffolding has already disappeared. However, not even that is the deepest fear. It is not just that the world may fall apart, the growing suspicion that perhaps we have already given up, Music adores more on the idea that over time things would work themselves out, that progress could be slow, uneven, frustrating, but that it would still continue to advance. However, lately that belief seems naive. Dorsmer with panic comes with a shrug, a tired laugh at the headlines, an empty silence after the bad news. It is not panic. It is fatigue, the feeling that collapse is no longer to come. It is here, and we're just trying to make it look normal. A pessimist is not someone who wants the end. It is someone who can no longer imagine a future worth waiting for. It shows in their tone, a soft bitterness wrapped in irony. They have stopped trying to fix things. They have stopped trying to fight, not because they're lazy or cruel, but because they have contemplated the magnitude of the problems and have felt the climatic systems that lean beyond the point of return the economies emptied by greed, the more spectacle than governance politics, a culture that seems to devour itself faster than it can understand why, and, through it all, the feeling that nothing will be resolved in time, or perhaps never. Dorsmer, a kind of emotional collapse. People joke about it, turns it into a meme, wears it like armor, because if you can't imagine a solution, at least you can soften the fear with black humor. You can feel smart for seeing the truth, even if that truth tastes like ash. But behind the irony, there is something sadder. They wanted to believe, they tried, they saw the world asking for change, and then they saw the powerful yawn. And now, they do not enrage, they fade, 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 they fade. It is the cruelty of despair which forces you to first believe in something worth losing. But what if we do not lose the world? What if we win? What if we cheat death, fix decay, avoid collapse? Then we face an even darker question than doom. What if the future never ends? The ethics of eternal life, when death ceases to be the end that you sometimes imagine. Not a heaven, not a myth, just a future where death is optional, a pill, a machine, a procedure, something that improves biology until your body stops aging. Your cells repair themselves forever, and time becomes something you overcome. At first, it seems like a dream, the end of funerals, the end of pain, more time with the people you love, the opportunity to become anything, learn everything, see what the world becomes in 1,000 years. But then the questions come. Who lives forever and who does not? What happens to meaning when life has no end? What happens to memory when it extends over centuries? We have built entire cultures around the limits of time we fight. Because we know it will not last, we love more. Because we know we will lose, we forgive. Because we will not have infinite opportunities if you eliminate the limit. What fills that space? The ethics of eternal life is not only a question of technology, but of justice. If only the rich can afford it, will we create a permanent class of immortals? If minds live through software, do they still have rights? And if someone wants to die, but cannot, is not that a new form of prison? Even more silently, something stranger happens, a kind of spiritual erosion. When you believe in death, you live as if you are borrowing time. You choose carefully, you forgive more, you pay attention, but immortality attenuates the urgency. You deviate, you postpone, you lose the pressure that turned moments into memories, and little by little, time ceases to be precious. It simply lengthens, and there's the most disturbing part. What if you get bored? What if the future is not better? What if you survive everyone you have loved? What if your mind fractures not from trauma, but from eternity? Eternal life sounds like a mercy, but stretched too far it begins to look like an exile. And still we pursue it, because we fear death more than time, because letting go seems more difficult than holding on forever. But the future not only offers a longer life, it offers bigger questions, so big that they cannot be touched, let alone answered. Next, we enter one of them, a kind of entity from which we cannot escape, which we cannot understand, and which may already be within the concept of hyperobjects, things too vast to touch. You go out and feel the warmth of the sun, see the sky, the clouds, the city moving around you. Everything seems close, manageable, something you can observe, maybe even influence, but somewhere beyond your senses, something else is developing, something too big, too long to follow, too complex to hold in your mind all at once. This is the disturbing idea of the hyperobject coined by philosopher Timothy Morton. A hyperobject is something so massive in time and space that it defies understanding. Climate change, nuclear radiation, microplastics, deep time. You can observe its parts. The increase in the level of the oceans, the melting of the glaciers, the debris adrift. But the thing in itself is too vast, too entangled, too omnipresent. It is not invisible. It is simply too big to be able to stand outside of it. And there is the trap, because when something exists on a scale beyond human perception, we treat it as if it is not real. We delay it, debate it, and deny it, not out of malice, but because our minds are not made for this type of knowledge. We have evolved to detect threats in the savannah, not to feel the weight of parts per million of carbon. A hyperobject does not need to hide. It overwhelms simply by existing, moving through the centuries while we think in days, shaping the results long before we realize the cause. And once you recognize one, they're everywhere. They alter our way of thinking, of planning, of relating to each other. You try to fight against one, and your tools seem too small. You try to ignore it, and it buzzes behind everything you do. We like to believe that we are in control, but hyperobjects reveal the opposite. That much of what shapes our future has already begun, that we are within systems too vast to direct them, and yet we survive, or at least we believe that, because there is a question that no hyperobject can answer. If they have already ended previous civilizations to ours, would we even know? Because sometimes silence is not the absence of disaster, but proof that it has already happened. The anthropic shadow, when survival hides evidence. You look back in history, and you feel relieved. The world did not end, the asteroid did not impact, the nuclear bombs were never launched, the pandemic spread, but civilization resisted again and again. We have been on the edge of the abyss, and we have taken a step back. It almost seems like proof that we are resilient, that we will always get ahead. But what if that feeling is just an illusion? The anthropic shadow suggests a darker truth, that the only reason we are here to observe the past is because the worst disasters left no one to talk about them. Imagine a filter, a line in history separating the eras that can be remembered from those that cannot. Perhaps there were restarts of civilization of which we will never find traces. Perhaps intelligent life arose elsewhere on Earth or beyond and disappeared before it could send a signal. Not because it was weak, but because the risks it faced did not give it a second chance. This is not just a mental experiment. It changes the way we interpret everything. Every survival pattern, every case of luck, every moment in which a catastrophe has been narrowly avoided. All of them seem like proof that we are doing something right. But there is the trick. We can only count the dangerous situations that we have survived, not those that ended in silence. The anthropic shadow hides the greatest dangers behind the quietest curtains and distorts our judgment. Makes extinction seem rare only because, when it happens, there is no one left to call it that. You don't see the true extent of risk when you are alive to measure it. The dead do not write history, so we assume safety. We build systems based on luck. We plan for tomorrow with the confidence of survivors who never realized how close the end was. But the deepest fear is not only for the past. It is about what we might already be doing now, without realizing who might have to live with the consequences. The problem of future generations when the EICS outlives us. Every day we make decisions, some important, others that we forget. We recycle, we vote, we drive, we eat, and we have the quiet conviction that our actions matter, or at least that they mainly affect the world around us now. But what if the true weight of those decisions was not felt until centuries from now? The problem of future generations raises a question that we rarely ask ourselves directly. What do we owe to people who do not yet exist? They are not mere theoretical descendants. They are real people. Their minds will one day look back, walk the same streets, breathe the same air if we leave them something to breathe. And yet, they have no voice in our systems. They have no vote. They have no money. They have no legal status. They cannot protest. They cannot express their suffering, which has not yet happened. So we pretend that it does not matter, but it does matter. Every irreversible decision we make about energy, about extinction, about technology, about war extends to a future in which someone else will have to live with the consequences, and this is where it becomes more disturbing. Our lives are shaped by people who lived a long time ago, who built the cities, the systems, the stories, who made decisions whose effects still resonate in our bodies and minds today. But did they plan for us? Did they even know that we were going to arrive? Are we different? We treat the future as a warehouse for our mistakes, somewhere far enough away to seem unreal, but close enough to contain everything we have postponed. We say things like future generations will solve it, forgetting that future generations might be begging us to act now. But it is difficult to feel urgency for a child who has not yet been born, difficult to imagine the pain of someone whose name has not yet been spoken. Even so, the moral weight is there. So, perhaps the question is not only what kind of world we are leaving behind, but if we're the kind of ancestors that we would want for ourselves. We build systems around the visible, but the invisible, the distant, the unborn, the overlooked, may be what inherits everything we have denied. And if we're not capable of feeling their pain, perhaps the problem is not time. Perhaps the problem is that we only assign value to things that we believe can think and feel without ever stopping to ask ourselves what it really means to feel. Panpsychism, when everything could be conscious. You have a stone in your hand. It is cold. Still, it seems the opposite of thought, pure matter. Silent and inert. You leave it on the ground without asking yourself even once what it feels, because we assume that things like rocks, rivers, winds, and stars are unconscious. We draw lines between life and non-life, between mind and matter, but what if that line was never real? Panpsychism is the disturbing idea that consciousness is not something rare. It is everywhere, not in the human sense. It is not self-aware, it does not dream, but in some primitive and tenuous way, each particle, each atom could contain the slightest glimmer of experience, a glimpse of perception at the most fundamental level, not enough to think or reflect, but enough to feel, however vague it sounds. It sounds like mysticism, but it has been considered by philosophers for centuries and recently by physicists and cognitive scientists who are trying to explain the most difficult problem of all: why consciousness exists. Because if you look closely, physical matter obeys laws, neurons are activated, molecules bind, but none of that explains why it feels like something, why experience exists when it could so easily not exist. Panpsychism does not solve the mystery. It rewrites the terms, suggests that matter and mind are not opposites, but twins, that the fabric of reality could be sewn with threads of consciousness too tenuous for us to detect, but omnipresent. And if this is true, then consciousness is not an emerging miracle. It is a property of a universe like gravity, like time, which raises a strange and silent question. If everything has a hint of consciousness, what kind of world have we been living in? We have spent centuries trying to map what is alive and what is not, but perhaps that was the wrong map. Perhaps consciousness is not something we earn, but something we discover layer by layer as we delve into the simulation we call reality. Simulation argument. When probability replaces reality, we have already questioned the layers. We have wondered if the world around us could be simulated, not once, but many times, a nested illusion wrapped in another, adrift through a chain of fictions from which you cannot escape. But this is not that. It is not about how it feels to live in a simulation, but why you should assume that you already are. The argument proposed by philosopher Nick Bostrom is not based on technical failures, dreams, or déjà vu. He does not care how immersive the illusion seems. It starts with something colder: mathematics. The logic is simple and terrifying. If any civilization somewhere develops the technology to simulate conscious beings and decides to run even a fraction of the simulations, the number of simulated minds would greatly exceed that of real ones. Statistically speaking, it is much more likely that you are one of the many simulated minds than one of the few original ones. The world you know, your body, your memories, your choices, may not be false in the cinematographic sense. They may be just one of the trillions of digital echoes indistinguishable from any base reality that ever existed. And here's the part that disturbs even more than the logic. We would not know it. We cannot know it, because every test we perform, every experiment we design, would only confirm the consistency of the simulation itself. You would be using the rules of the illusion to question it. This is not a call to paranoia. It is a confrontation with scale, with possibility, with the idea that your consciousness, might not be rare or miraculous, but simply common, manufactured, a version among millions of variations, all thinking they're the original. And even if the probability is small, the implications are not, because if we are in a simulation, it means that we were created by someone or something for some reason. And if we are not, it still means we could be at any moment in. Anyway, the ground under your feet is no longer stable. Not because it is false, but because it never had to be real in the first place. And in that possibility of being simulated, observed, or duplicated, a question becomes stronger. If none of this was built for you, if no one is watching, if the simulation is indifferent to its characters, then how do you live in a universe that never cared about your existence? Cosmic indifference, when the universe does not even flinch. You look up towards the stars, billions of them scattered across the sky, so vast that it barely seems real. You feel something stirring. Perhaps it is a quiet, painful feeling of being small, but then the feeling changes because the stars do not care that you're looking, the cosmos does not feel your awe, the galaxies do not know your name, they rotate, burn, die, and nothing stops. Not for beauty, not for pain, not for you. This is the truth at the heart of cosmic indifference. That the universe is not hostile, nor kind, only indifferent. It does not realize your triumphs. It does not mourn your losses. It does not keep track of justice, tragedy, or love. Planets collide without remorse. Children devour their children. Black holes swallow light without ever asking why. And we are born into this fragile mind, in a faltering bodies that struggle to make sense of a void that never gives it to us. We write stories, invent gods, build rituals to pretend there is a plan, because the alternative, that we are chemical accidents adrift in a cold and ancient silence, is almost too difficult to bear. But the silence remains. It does not answer prayers. It does not punish cruelty. It does not reward kindness. The universe, there is a plan, because the alternative, that we are chemical accidents adrift in a cold and ancient silence, is almost too much to bear. But the silence remains. It does not answer prayers. It does not punish cruelty. It does not reward kindness. The universe moves, and we are dragged with it like leaves in a current that does not know that we are clinging, and yet, in the face of that indifference, we act. We love even knowing that loss is inevitable. We create beauty knowing that it may disappear. We seek meaning knowing that it may not exist, not because the universe cares, but because we do. For some, that is not enough. The silence does not seem peaceful to them. It seems like a mockery, and when all the old comforts crumble, what remains is not freedom. It is something colder, darker, something that stops pretending that there was ever light. The dark enlightenment, when knowing more means believing less. You start with questions, the kind that once led to hope. Who are we? Why are we here? What is a good life? You search in philosophy, science, spirituality, layer by layer, stripping yourself of illusions, hoping to find something pure beneath everything. But sometimes when you strip everything, there is nothing waiting for you, just a deeper darkness. The dark enlightenment begins as a search for truth and ends with the understanding that truth may not offer comfort, progress, or even meaning, only cold and insensitive knowledge. It is not a movement. It is a shift, a tone, a recognition that the more we learn about the world, its systems, its origins, its mechanisms, the harder it becomes to believe in the stories that once gave us warmth. You look at evolution and you do not see design, but chance. Study history and you do not see justice, but cycles of power. You trace the origins of morality and you do not find truth, but utility. The Enlightenment once meant escaping from superstition, from ignorance, from fear, but the dark version strips even the ideals and says that perhaps the universe was never meant to be understood, that perhaps reason does not lead to peace, that perhaps the more you see, the more you realize how little there was in this vision. Humanism becomes a flattering story, progress a temporary illusion, ethics a fragile agreement that we confuse with the truth, and what remains is clarity, not exactly despair, but a clarity that feels like standing in a ruined temple, with no gods, no sanctuary, no echoes, only walls burned by time. Some find power in this, others collapse under its weight, because once you stop believing that the world is fair or reparable, you start asking darker questions, not only about life, but about judgment, about punishment, about whether suffering might not be a mistake at all. And that leads us to something even more disturbing, the idea that hell could exist, not as a metaphor, but as a design. The problem of hell, when justice becomes eternal punishment. You have heard all your life the idea that there is a place reserved for the wicked, a realm of fire, of pain, of endless consequences, a place where justice denied in life is imparted after death. It sounds harsh, but also fair. Evil must go somewhere, but then you stop to think, and the more you think, the worse it gets. The problem of hell is not whether people deserve punishment, but whether someone deserves infinite torment for finite actions, a million years of agony for a moment of doubt, an eternity of fire for a life that lasted less than an instant in cosmic time. If justice means anything, punishment corresponds to the crime, and what kind of being creates such a place not only allows it, creates it a space not to correct, but to contain, not to rehabilitate, but to destroy forever, with precision, with permanence. You start to wonder if this is justice or perfected cruelty. Some defenders say that it is not about fire and sulfur, that it is about separation from the divine, from the absence of love, but absence can be just as cruel, especially when it is eternal, a silence that never ends, a door that never opens again. And there's the twist that hurts the most. If hell exists, it is not only for monsters. It could be for people who chose the wrong story, the wrong God, the wrong truth, the wrong time to believe. And if the price for being wrong is infinite suffering, then we are no longer talking about justice. We're talking about armed fear. Some try to make peace with this. They say that it is only a warning, a symbol, a necessary threat to keep us at bay. But what kind of morality needs terror to stand? And if the gates of hell are open forever, what does that say about who holds the key? You begin to feel the weight of that question, and then another thought comes, quieter but even heavier. If the world is broken, if justice is twisted, if pain can last forever, then why go on? Why live? But there's an answer, not from comfort, but from rebellion. Is the revolt against suicide. When the absurd demands challenge, you wake up one morning and realize that there is no grand plan, no divine script, no hidden meaning waiting to be revealed in the last chapter. The world simply is. People live, people die. Joy flickers, suffering lingers, and the universe, vast and silent, offers no explanation for any of this. This is the absurd, and for Albert Camus, it was the most urgent question that philosophy could pose. If life has no inherent meaning, why not end it? Why keep breathing, loving, building, forgiving when nothing lasts and nothing guarantees that any of that matters? When even our greatest joys end up being erased by time, and our deepest pains leave no permanent mark on a world that forgets us the moment we disappear. Cam called this the only truly serious philosophical problem. Suicide, not in the clinical sense, but in the existential one, a confrontation with the raw truth that life offers no intrinsic reason to continue, no promise of redemption, no cosmic reward for resistance. And yet his answer was not desperation, but rebellion, not of the kind that burns cities or overthrows kings, but a personal and silent challenge, a choice to live because the world makes no sense, to face the absurd not with surrender, but with a strange and stubborn joy. He imagined Copus, the condemned man, endlessly pushing a rock uphill only to see it roll down again and again, forever. And yet Camus tells us that we must imagine him happy, not because he escapes the absurd, but because he sees it clearly and still decides to push. This is the rebellion, the refusal to be broken by the truth, the decision to keep showing up, not by ignoring the futility of life, but with full awareness of it. You create your own meaning, not because it is real in some cosmic sense, but because it is yours, chosen, elaborated, defended against silence. You become the author of a story that will never end. You build rituals from chaos. You sculpt a purpose from the senseless and call it life. Not by illusion, but because creation, even of a fragile and temporary meaning, is the ultimate rebellion. But that resistance is exhausting. Some do not find joy in the struggle. Some look at the absurd and do not see a rock, but a void, not something to resist, but something to fall into, because although Camus offers a way forward, he never denies the weight of the question. And what comes next is not a revolt at all. It is what happens when the weight finally wins, the philosophy of despair, when meaning itself crumbles. At first, despair does not feel like a collapse. It feels like a slowing down, like waking up and not reaching anything more than a voice that once hummed silently under your life. Hope, purpose, forward movement have been silenced, and in that silence, a question begins to form. What if there is no meaning left to find? Not just no cosmic plan, not just no higher power, but nothing at all, no story to tell yourself, no light at the end of the tunnel, not even the illusion that things will make sense someday. The gears keep turning, but you know that you no longer believe that they are connected to anything. This is not depression. It is not pain. It is a philosophical state, a moment in which all your scaffolding has collapsed, in which the ideas that once kept you standing now seem flimsy like sets on a stage that is falling apart. Philosophers have touched this space before. Schopenhauer called life a pendulum that oscillates between pain and boredom. Kierkegaard felt the weight of despair not as a weakness, but as an awakening to the realization that you are free, but that freedom offers nothing to hold on to. Even Camus, who offered the rebellion, began in this place because despair is not the end of feeling. It is what happens when feeling persists even after faith has been lost. You keep longing, you keep suffering, you keep wanting something more, but you no longer know where to place that longing, which drifts without anchor like a signal launched into deep space with no one to listen on the other side. And over time you learn to stop asking, not because the questions are answered, but because they no longer seem useful to you. What do you do when hope dies silently, without spectacularity? You keep going, you eat, you sleep, you fulfill the script of life, even when the reasons evaporate. Not because you are weak, but because you have seen too much, felt too much, thought too long. Despair is not strong. It does not scream. It does not break things. It just sits next to you, a mirror with nothing behind it, a faceless truth. And in that numbness, in that stillness, something strange can happen. You begin to adapt, not recovering a purpose, but forgetting that you ever needed it. And when that forgetting becomes culture, when despair ceases to be a condition and becomes a norm, you get something darker, yet it is not suffering, but a world in which no one even remembers how to feel. The Last Man, when comfort replaces meaning. Imagine a future without wars, without struggles, without hunger, a world in which everyone lives longer, works less, suffers rarely, without gods, without revolutions, without truths to die for, only comfort, screens, soft pleasures, endless distractions, a civilization that has erased pain so thoroughly that it no longer remembers how to reach anything else. This is End's warning, a prophecy of what happens when humanity stops fighting for greatness and chooses security instead. He called this figure the Last Man. He does not rage, he does not dream, he does not rebel, he only seeks comfort. He avoids discomfort as if your dreams. He does not rebel. He only seeks comfort. He avoids discomfort as if it were a disease. He shuns challenges. He mocks intensity. He rolls his eyes at anything that dares to ask for sacrifice. He survives, but he does nothing else. And in N's eyes, that survival is the real tragedy, because something vital has been lost. Not only courage, but aspiration itself. There are no more high ideals. There is no more search for the sublime. There is no more creative madness or tragic beauty. Only a long and silent decay disguised as progress. The Last Man does not suffer. He becomes numb and calls that peace. But it is a superficial work, an oblivion, a sleepwalking through life, where all the edges have been smoothed, where all the high goals have been changed for minor risks. He no longer asks what life is for, only what he can avoid, And the terrifying thing is that he wins, he survives the heroes. He lasts longer than the visionaries. He builds systems so stable that they can sustain the void for generations. He does not destroy the world, he makes it irrelevant. And deep down, maybe that is already happening when meaning becomes shameful, when boredom is cured with algorithms, when belief is replaced by convenience. We approach that final figure who smiles satisfied, unperturbed, but not everyone can make peace with that numbness. Some still long for a reason, some still need a why, and in the absence of certainty, they take risks. Pascal's bet, when belief becomes a bet, you're not sure what to believe in you. Have seen the contradictions, the gods that cancel each other's, the sacred texts that fracture between cultures, the silence that follows each prayer. There is still something in you that whispers, "What if?" And that is where Pascal comes in. Not with faith, but with strategy. Believe in God, he argued, because it is the safest bet. If you are wrong, you lose nothing. If you are right, you win eternity. Disbelief, on the other hand, risks an infinite loss. It was not a sermon. It was a bet, a calculated move in an unknown game, a choice made not by belief, but by probabilities. But when you stare at that logic long enough, it starts to rot, because what kind of belief is born of fear? What kind of faith is chosen not by love or revelation, but by calculation? This is not worship. It is insurance, a preventive surrender to the idea that the universe punishes doubt more than it rewards sincerity. And even worse, what if the God you chose is the wrong one? What if the best you can do is offend the divine? What if heaven is not a reward for playing with the odds, but for not needing them? What if the mere act of betting your soul revealed a deeper absence of trust? Pascal's bet becomes a mirror of our spiritual anxiety. It reveals how desperate we are for certainty, how quickly we are willing to trade sincerity for security in its darkest form. The bet does not only apply to religion. It becomes a model for all our choices. Staying at work just in case the next one is worse. Staying in the relationship just in case loneliness is more difficult. Clinging to the lie just in case the truth demands too much. Telling yourself that you are happy just in case asking questions takes us somewhere colder. We make bets driven by fear every day and call them rational, sensible, responsible. We act as if caution were wisdom, even when it emptied us years ago. But what if that logic extended throughout a lifetime takes you somewhere empty? What if your whole existence becomes a long, cautious bet, trying not to lose instead of daring to live? What if you die with a perfectly balanced hand and nothing on the table? And here is the cruel twist. Not even the best bet can protect you from time, because in the end the bet does not end with revelation, nor with clarity, only with the ticking of something that you never really understood from the beginning. The problem of time. When the flow becomes a prison, you try to hold on to a moment, to a conversation, to a breath, to a second in which everything seems to be still long enough to matter. But it escapes, it always escapes, and no matter how hard you grab, time moves forward without blinking, unstoppable, indifferent, asks permission, does not wait, it simply erodes us. We measure it in clocks, in calendars, in wrinkles, in endings, but the more you delve, the stranger it gets. In physics, it is not even guaranteed that time is real, not in the way we perceive it. Some theories treat it as an illusion, a side effect of how our brain interprets entropy, a story we tell ourselves to make sense of change, and yet it governs everything. It cannot be rewound, it cannot be paused, it cannot exist outside of it. It shapes identity, memory, decay. You're always being pushed forward towards decisions, towards aging, towards death. You do not live in time. You're made of time. But here is the problem. We don't really know what it is. Is it a dimension, a force, or direction? Why does it only flow in one direction? Why can we remember the past, but never the future? And if time can bend under gravity, as Einstein demonstrated, then what is it really anchored to? Worse still, what if it is not anchored at all? Philosophers have tried to unravel it. Augustine said he knew what time was until someone asked him to explain it. Heidegger did not see it as something we went through, but as the very structure of existence. Time, he believed, was the horizon against which we live and die. But even from that point of view, time remains a paradox. It is freedom and confinement. It gives urgency to our lives and traps them in inevitability. Every decision is haunted by time. Every child who is born is thrown into its river. Every legacy is erased by it over time, and yet we keep moving through it, chasing permanence in a reality built on impermanence, telling ourselves that we can escape decay. But what happens when we create something, someone, knowing that it will be devoured by time, just like us? What does it mean to create life within a structure that we still do not understand? The ethics of creating life. When choice becomes responsibility, you bring a child into the world or consider doing so, and for a moment, it feels like love, like hope, like continuity, a spark that is transmitted forward, an imagined future. But beneath the heat, a darker question begins to take shape. Did they ask for this? No one consents to being born. No one signs up for pain, fear, or loss. Creating life is forcing someone into time, into hunger, confusion, heartbreak, and death. You give them beauty, yes, but also suffering. You give them sunsets, music and laughter along with pain, illness, and the knowledge that everything they love will someday disappear. Is that a gift or a burden wrapped in a pretty box? The philosopher David Beneder argues that it is always an imposition, that non-existence saves us from harm, while existence guarantees it. That by not being born we lose nothing because we are not there to regret it, but by being born we inherit all the risks, without anyone asking us. And even so, we choose to create out of love, out of instinct, out of loneliness, sometimes out of legacy, out of desperation, or out of pressure, sometimes simply because we want to see a smaller version of ourselves smiling at us. But the choice, whatever the reason, still carries weight because creating life is not just giving it. It is taking responsibility for a future that you cannot control, for a consciousness that you will never fully understand, for someone who may one day look back and ask you, why did you do this to me? And maybe you have an answer, maybe not, but the ethics are still heavy and unresolved. What does it mean to make another person suffer, to give them a life full of contradictions, just because you thought it was worth it? Because each life created brings with it 1,000 unknowns, traumas, illnesses, losses that you could never predict. Even love, the deepest feeling of a human being, will hurt them someday. And it was your choice that opened that door. And if their future fractures, if they get lost over time, what responsibility when your choice begins? Or does it continue to resonate through every version of the person you created, even when they move further away from who they once were? And what if the gift of life also carries the weight of witnessing the suffering that you caused and are now unable to alleviate? The problem of identity over time, when one's self becomes a stranger. You look at an old photo of yourself, maybe from when you were a child or teenager or just younger, and you remember the day, the clothes, the light, the smell of the air, but while you stare, something doesn't fit. The person in the photo is not exactly you. They had different fears, different dreams. They had not been broken in the same way as you. So who were they? And what is more disturbing, who are you now? The problem of identity over time asks whether you're still the same person you used to be, not legally or biologically, but existentially. Are you the same self that woke up yesterday, 10 years ago? Do you have a core that persists, or are you just a constantly rewritten story? Philosophers have struggled with this for centuries. Locke believed that memory was the glue. If you could remember it, it was you, but memory fades, distorts, lies, and what about the things you forget, the traumas you buried, the nights you denied? Are you responsible for the things done by a version of you that no longer exists? The Ship of Theseus asks it through a metaphor. If you replace all the planks of a ship, is it still the same ship? But we are not planks, we are neurons, cells, ideas, and they are constantly changing, sometimes slowly, sometimes violently. We mourn the past, fear the future, and live in a present that slips through our fingers. And despite everything we pretend that we are complete, but what if we are not? What if identity is not a thread, but a collage, a mosaic of contradictory cells sewn together by memory, trauma, culture, and time? And at any given moment, a self takes the stage while the others wait backstage. So when someone changes, really changes, do we honor that or accuse them of betrayal? When someone hurts us and then becomes someone completely different, do we forgive the new self or punish the old one? And when the self is broken by an illness, an idea, a grief, or rage, what do we call that person now? A stranger, a transformation, or something more dangerous? Violence is a political tool. When blood becomes language, you see a protest. At first it is peaceful, with signs of fortuitous challenge and motion. But then something changes, a window breaks, a line breaks, someone shouts, and in a matter of seconds, it transforms from movement to chaos, and the world begins to discuss whether that is necessary. Violence is often framed as a failure, a collapse, a tragic last resort. But for much of history, it was not the end of politics. It was politics. Kings ruled through fear. Revolutions were born in blood. Empires expanded not with votes, but with fire. Even peace sometimes was something people had to fight for. We want to believe that we have evolved beyond that reason, discourse, and democracy are enough. But under every polite negotiation hides a shadow, a reminder that force is still waiting backstage. Silent, patient, always watching. The philosopher Frantz Fanon did not flinch at this. For the colonized, he wrote that violence was not just an expression of rage. It was a language, a way to regain agency in a system built to erase them. When all peaceful paths are blocked, what is left but destruction? And yet, violence is never clean. It not only challenges power, it reshapes it. Once violence enters the conversation, it not only points to injustice, it transforms the people who wield it. Even those who strike in the name of justice must live with what they have done. But the danger is not only in the act itself. It is in how the violence flows, in how quickly it becomes seductive, in how easily it replaces thought. And in modern systems, where the media frame perception faster than the truth can reach, a single act of violence can rewrite the narrative. A broken window becomes a symbol. An act of self-defense becomes an armed story. Power changes not with facts, but with symbols. And that is the risk, because violence not only destroys structures, it destroys stories. And when the stories collapse, we begin to wonder which ones were real in the first place, or even worse, if reality itself was ever real. The deprivation of reality, when what is missing shapes what is real. You walk through a familiar space, your childhood home, your favorite street, and something seems strange, not because something has changed, but because something is missing, a smell, a sound, a presence. You can't describe it, but it empties the moment, as if the soul of the place had silently left. That emptiness, that absence, is what the deprivation of reality tries to name. It is the idea that reality is not only made of things that are present, but also of what should be there and is not. They are not illusions, nor fictions, but structural absences, voids that we do not see but feel. You don't miss what has never existed. You miss what was once possible and is no longer. From this point of view, reality is not only a landscape of matter and energy, but a haunted field of lost potentialities, a network of absences that shape the present as much as any object. What is not defines what is, like a melody defined by the silences between the notes. We think of reality as fullness, but deprivation reminds us that reality is also emptiness. The father who never stayed, the revolution that never came, the version of yourself that you never became. They're not fantasies, they are absences that oppress us like a weight, and the more we try to fill them, the more we feel their shape. Deprivation endures in places where there was once meaning. It is not only emptiness, it is that emptiness after the presence, a space that once housed something essential and now resonates with the memory of it. Philosophers lament when writing that all suffering begins as a form of separation, a disconnection from the truth, from others, from God, from ourselves. Deprivation deepens that idea, not only as a loss of connection, but as a reality structured around what is no longer allowed to be true, and this leads to a deeper unease. What happens when so much has been stripped away that there is nothing left to lose, not because it has been taken from us, but because we were never allowed to fully exist? There's nothing left to lose, not because it has been taken from us, but because it was never allowed to fully exist. And in that absence, we begin to glimpse a final possibility, that reality and perhaps the self itself do not disappear in fire or collapse, but dissolve in silence. Ontology of oblivion. When being is built to disappear, you wake up in the middle of the night without knowing what woke you up, without sound, without light, only the dense hum of the silence of existence. And for a fraction of a second, the world feels empty, not broken, not evil, just absent, as if everything was still there, but barely. That feeling has a name. The ontology of oblivion is the idea that being itself can be designed to disappear, that existence is not held together by permanence, but by decay. Not only the death of things, but the concept of being that carries in its structure the inevitability of being forgotten. Most philosophies start from the premise that being is good, that existing is preferable to not existing, that permanence is the goal, and that everything that fades is a failure. But what if that is wrong? What if everything we touch, memories, identities, civilizations, even atoms, are temporary by design, not due to some defect or external force, but as an inherent characteristic, a cosmic architecture created not to preserve, but to erase? Oblivion is not just an outcome. It is a property, a fundamental law. Think of all the things you will never know existed, all the thoughts never written, the names buried before language, the faces erased before history. What if reality, in its essence, is more absence than presence, more silence than sound? The theologian Meister Eckhart once wrote that to truly find God, one must go through a kind of unknowing, a divine oblivion. In that sense, oblivion is not a punishment, it is transcendence. But there is nothing comforting in it when it happens to you, because if oblivion is the final state of all being, then everything we build, love, and believe is sand briefly molded before the tide, and yet we continue to mold it even knowing that it will not last, which raises a deeper and more disturbing possibility. What if before entering this existence we knew that everything would be lost, and even so we accepted the contract of oblivion, when oblivion is the price of being here? There's a strange feeling that you have carried all your life, the feeling that something was agreed somewhere along before you were born, not a memory, just a weight, an all too familiar, a type of oblivion that does not seem accidental. What if existence came with conditions? The contract of oblivion is the idea that before entering this world, in this body, in this timeline, in this crumbling moment, we accept a condition. You can live, but you will forget. You will forget where you come from. You will forget who you are. You will forget that you accepted, and we accept it. Not because we were deceived, but because remembering would break the whole experience. Carrying the truth would paralyze the story. So we sign metaphorically or metaphysically with the ink of surrender. We choose amnesia in exchange for sensation. We choose blindness in exchange for the right to see. You're not supposed to remember, but sometimes, in dreams, in pain, or in stillness, a thread pulls you, not toward the place of face, but toward the knowledge, a fracture in the narrative, a shadow behind every moment that whispers to you that you said yes, that you knew this would hurt, that it is not a punishment, that it is the price, and the deepest cruelty is that you cannot go back. Even if you remember, you cannot undo the terms. The contract does not end when you understand it. It ends when you disappear. Some believe that this is liberation, that forgetting is mercy, that living without the weight of origin is the only way to truly be, but others feel betrayed, not by life, but by the silence that followed, because if there was a beginning, if something or someone offered us this deal, why did he remain silent after we said yes? The silence of the first cause, when the origin refuses to speak. Everything you have known comes from something, a father, a moment, a spark. Each event goes back to something else, to a chain of causality that extends deeper into the past. But no matter how far back you go, in the end you run into a wall, a beginning, the first cause, the point at which everything began without anything before. But when you reach that imaginary origin, you find something unexpected. It is not light, nor wisdom, nor even power, just silence. The silence of the first cause is the idea that the origin of all things, whether you call it God, the universe, the singularity, the one, offers no message, no reason, no intention. It simply is and always has been. We long for a beginning that explains us. We want the first domino to have a meaning, to tell us why suffering exists, why beauty exists, why we exist. But what if the first cause does not care? Not because it is cruel, but because it is empty, an emptiness that resonated into existence, a flash that ignited a chain of events for no reason. The universe was not whispered into existence with love or purpose. It simply happened, and everything else followed is cruel. But because it is empty, an emptiness that resonated to life, a flash that ignited a chain of events for no reason. The universe was not whispered into existence with love or purpose. It simply happened, and everything else followed. You cannot interrogate the origin. It will not answer you. You can trace physics, cosmology, metaphysics, theology, but at the root of everything there is a silence deeper than understanding, and it haunts us because if the principle had no voice, then all meaning is built on a foundation that never promised truth. And what is worse, maybe it did whisper once. Maybe we have simply forgotten how to listen to it. Perhaps we drown it out with our own noise, our own fear, our own desperate need to matter. So we keep asking, praying, searching, not for salvation, but for a reason. And sometimes when we lose someone or lose ourselves, we wonder if that silence could ever be broken, if what was once gone could return, and if so, if we would have the right to bring it. The ethics of resurrection. When love defies death and someone dies, you cry, you scream in the silence, you would give anything to see him again, and someday, through science or magic or something stranger, you can. The question is no longer whether we can bring them back, but whether we should. The ethics of resurrection begins with love, but ends in uncertainty. Restoring a lost life sounds like the ultimate mercy, but what are you reviving? A body, a memory, an interrupted mind? You tell yourself that it is for them, but what if it's really for you? They did not choose to return. They did not consent to re-enter. You decided that they were incomplete, and now they must awaken to a world that moved on without them, a new language, a new pain, a future that they never asked to inherit. Is that resurrection, or is it displacement? And if resurrection becomes something common, an option, a service, a button that we can press, what does that do to death itself? Does pain become impatience? Do funerals become plays? Does the purpose that once gave urgency to life dissolve? And then, the deepest fear, what if the person who returns is not the person who left? Perhaps the gaps in memory change them. Perhaps technology cannot capture everything. Or perhaps death, once crossed, reorganizes the soul in ways that we do not understand. You have brought them back, but they look at you with unknown eyes. Who are you to them now? Some traditions warn against resurrection, not because it is impossible, but because it is unnatural, a rupture of the moral order, an act of arrogance, an interruption of the silence that we're destined to enter once and only once. But the pain of reversing loss is so human, so fierce, that ethics blur. We say that we want to restore life, but perhaps what we really want is to rewind time, to pretend that it never happened, to freeze the moment before everything changed, and when that fails, when time refuses to stop or go back, a darker conclusion remains, that all moments, however sacred they may be, are doomed to disappear, and if time erases everything, then perhaps nothing was really real to begin with. Temporal nihilism. When time destroys all meaning, you sit with someone you love, you share a look, a laugh, a quiet joy so pure that it seems eternal, and yet, even as it unfolds, a part of you knows that it will end. That time only allows the moment to exist to then snatch it from you. That is the cruelty of time. It offers everything and erases it just as quickly. Temporal nihilism is the idea that time not only advances, but undoes, that even if something has value in the present, that value dissolves with distance. Memories fade, records disappear, the impact of each action, each love, each sacrifice evaporates into the abyss of forward movement. If nothing lasts, does anything matter? We pretend that time is a stage in which meaning can unfold against. But what if time is not the backdrop, but the destroyer? What if it is entropy and disorder? Heaven's not only of matter, but of purpose, a slow, unstoppable erosion, not of buildings or bodies, but of meaning itself. Even the deepest lives collapse under its weight. Kingdoms fall, stars die, names disappear, art that moved generations ends up being forgotten, and in the distant future, when even atoms decompose and the universe expands into a cold void, what is left to say? Did anything matter at all? We try to get ahead of this. We write, we record, we build legacies, but every record has a half-life. Every monument is a future ruin, and one day there will be no one left who cares that we ever tried. Temporal nihilism does not say that life has no value. It says that value cannot survive time. And if that is true, then ethics, memory, love are not permanent forces. They are illusions that are held together by shared attention, and attention always deviates. So what do you do in a world where the clock erases everything? Some deny it, some despair, and some seek an escape, a way to know something, anything with certainty, something that time cannot erase, something that does not change, something absolute. But what if you found it? What if that knowledge was worse than ignorance? The horror of perfect knowledge, when knowing everything destroys the self. You have wished for it before, silently, half seriously, to know everything, all the secrets, all the truths, all the reasons behind the pain. No more confusion, no more doubts, just clarity. But what if you got it? The horror of perfect knowledge. Imagine a mind that perceives everything, every thought, every motive, every consequence throughout time. Not only facts, but everything, the lies behind every smile, the patterns behind every tragedy, the hidden structure behind every cruel coincidence. You see the complete chain, the true weight of your decisions, the betrayals interwoven in your goodness, the lives shattered by your slightest indifference. And, worst of all, you see that the same is true for everyone. Every saint is a contradiction. Every love is a record of tacit costs. Every act of kindness entangled in unintentional harm. Perfect knowledge does not free you. It corrodes the mystery that previously protected you. Doubt gave you room for hope, but now you see too much. You can no longer forget. You can no longer believe, and little by little your sense of identity begins to crack. Not because you are overwhelmed, but because you no longer know how to be. How do you live when nothing can be forgiven, nothing misinterpreted, and nothing invisible? You know every humiliation that others still carry. You know every moment in which you were the villain and never knew it. You see the child you once were and the inevitable path to what you became. And the silence becomes louder because knowledge, pure and unfiltered knowledge, offers you no peace, isolates you, sharpens you, turns your mind into a cage made of mirrors without any angle to hide. You begin to long for something you once despised, oblivion, the right not to know, to let the past remain buried, to return the burden of truth to the shadows. But some things do not remain buried, neither in you nor in those who came before you, and sometimes what they refuse to carry becomes yours, a transgenerational nightmare. When the past possesses the living, you feel it sometimes in moments that make no sense, a pain that is not yours, a fear without cause, a deep and inexplicable shame that comes before thought. You trace your life backwards in search of the origin and find nothing, but the sensation persists like the smoke from a fire that you have not lit. What if it didn't start with you? The transgenerational ghost is the idea that trauma does not stand still. It travels, it hides in the body, in silence, in gestures and instinct. You inherit more than eye color and posture. You inherit wounds, pain that was never expressed, rage that was never allowed, secrets that shaped the lives of those who preceded you and now shape you invisibly. Science has addressed this in epigenetics, how the trauma of hunger, war, or abuse can subtly mark the genetic code. But philosophy sees something deeper, not only chemical residues, but an existential echo. You're haunted by lives you never lived, not metaphorically or romantically, but literally. Your anxiety may not be yours, your self-sabotage, your fear of love, your drive to succeed. All of this may be a response to ghosts you have never seen, ancestors who swallowed their pain so deeply that it was transmitted to their descendants. And the curse is rarely noisy. It manifests in the form of patterns, the same arguments, the same heartbreak, the same failure repeating itself throughout generations, like a curse disguised as coincidence. But how do you heal a wound that was never directly yours? You try therapy, you try rituals, you try to isolate yourself from the past, but the shadow does not dissipate because it not only wants to be released, it wants to be recognized. It wants you to say, I see what they endured, I feel what they carried, and I carry it too. And yet, there's a deeper terror beneath all of this, because if pain can be transmitted like blood, if suffering can resonate through the centuries, then what does that say about the system that allowed it? What does that say about the divine, about the architect of this inheritance, and about whether morality was taken into account in its design? God beyond good and evil, when the divine transcends morality, you grow up thinking that God is good, that justice flows from divinity, that light triumphs over darkness because it must be so, that pain makes sense, and that the universe, however mysterious it may be, leans towards love. But then you look closer and see children born in torment, innocence, crushed under systems they never chose, the long silence of history, where the wicked prosper and the good are erased. You cry out to heaven, not with faith, but with accusation, and all that responds is silence. Some say that it is a test, that suffering refines us, that the plan is unknowable but good. But what if that is a lie we tell ourselves to maintain sanity? And what if God is neither good nor evil? And what if the divine completely transcends our categories? This is not the God of consolation, not the shepherd. This is the force behind existence itself, indifferent, infinite, and totally beyond the moral frameworks we use to make sense of our lives. Nietzsche saw it coming when he declared that God had died. It was not a triumph, it was terror, because if the source of value has disappeared or never existed, then morality becomes a human invention. And if God exists but is beyond morality, then our pain is not justified. It is simply allowed. We are not the center. We are not the beloved. We are an accident. The divine bothers not in correcting. And that changes everything, because if God is beyond good and evil, then no one comes to balance the scales. There is no reward for the righteous, nor punishment for the cruel, only a cosmos that spirals under rules that we have not created watched, if we are, by something that neither smiles nor cries. So what are we then? Moral agents in an immoral universe? Narrators who disguise chaos with meaning? Beings tainted by the illusion that goodness was always guaranteed? Because once that illusion is broken, it is not only the world that seems to be wrong, it is the very nature of being ontological contamination. When thought itself becomes a toxin, you come across an idea, perhaps in a book, in a dream, or in a late-night conversation. At first it seems harmless, a strange thought, an abstract curiosity, but something changes, the idea persists, coils in your mind, and refuses to leave, and little by little it changes the way you see everything. Ontological contamination is the belief that some ideas are not only dangerous to believe, but dangerous to know, that there are certain truths or even suggestions of truth that infect the structure of your reality and, once introduced, reshape your way of relating to the world, not only psychologically, but metaphysically. You can't stop thinking about them. They alter your internal logic, empty comfort, corrupt language, and do not need to be true to be toxic. They only need to seem plausible, like the idea that nothing is real, that no one else is aware, that free will is an illusion, that morality is a trick of biology, that time is already over, and that you're only acting by memory. You heard it once, and now it's part of you, contaminated, not because you're irrational, but because your sense of meaning depends on certain things remaining intact. And when the wrong thought sneaks in, too sharp, too deep, it not only threatens your vision of the world, but distorts the foundations that support it. This is not paranoia, but your sense of meaning depends on you being irrational, but because your sense of reality depends on certain things remaining intact. And when the wrong thought sneaks in too hard, too deep, it not only threatens your vision of the world, but distorts the foundations that support it. This is not paranoia. It is ontology, the study of being, and it is here where the real danger begins. Because if ideas can rot the structure of reality from within, then knowledge is no longer a neutral act. It is dangerous not only to believe, but also to exist, and once infected, you are never the same again. You walk as if nothing has changed, but you feel it, a small flaw in perception, a loss of warmth in the world, a fracture in your connection with others, and, little by little, you begin to suspect something unbearable, that the more you understand, the more alone you feel. Metaphysical loneliness, when no one can follow you inside. There is the loneliness you feel in a room full of people, the one that comes from being misunderstood, ignored, invisible, but deeper than that, even beyond language, there's another kind of loneliness, one that no presence can solve, one that follows you wherever you go because it is part of you, metaphysical. Loneliness is the idea that, at the core of existence, each person is fundamentally alone, not only emotionally, but existentially, that no matter how close we get, no matter how deeply we love or how perfectly we communicate, we are trapped inside a consciousness that no one else can enter. You can describe your thoughts, but no one can feel them. You can share your pain, but no one can touch it. Even the most intimate connection is still a bridge, never a fusion, and that bridge can never be fully crossed. You live your whole life inside a mind, a body, a stream of consciousness that no one else will ever witness. People can observe your actions, interpret your words, but the real texture of your experience is only yours. You're the only one who will ever know what it feels like to be you. Philosophers call this the problem of other minds, but it is more than a problem. It is a condition, a truth with which we dance in every conversation, in every act of kindness, in every desperate attempt to be understood. Because deep down we know that the best we can hope for is an approximation, and that if we are lucky, this loneliness is not solved by company. In fact, it is sometimes more visible in moments of closeness, when you realize how big the gap really is, how far your inner world extends even from those who know you best. And yet we keep trying, we keep talking, loving, writing, trying to build a bridge between islands that will never fully touch. But for some, the weight of that distance becomes too heavy, the silence too sharp, the separation too complete, and when connection seems impossible, a different question arises. If you were never going to be truly known, was it worth existing? The ethics of non-existence, when absence becomes a moral choice, when you did not ask to be born, no one does. One day you simply find yourself here, breathing, thinking, suffering. You inherit a body, a name, a history, and a world already in motion. And from the first moment, the question is never whether you exist, but how you perform that existence. But what if the question had been different? The ethics of non-existence turns that question around and asks if not existing could be the kindest option, not only for the unborn, but for those who already live. It challenges the assumption that life is good by default, that being is always better than not being, that presence is preferable to absence. But is it if someone suffers so deeply that joy is unattainable, if the world offers nothing more than pain and confusion, if the burden of being is heavier than its beauty? Can choosing not to be a moral act? And what happens before life begins? As we have discussed before, the philosopher David Benatar argues that bringing someone into existence without their consent is always unethical, because to exist is to suffer something, but not to exist is to suffer nothing. The absence of pleasure does not harm what does not exist, but the presence of pain always harms the living. It is not a popular argument. Most reject it because it threatens the entire structure of what we tell ourselves. That life is a gift, that birth is sacred, that being is the supreme good. But what if it isn't? This does not glorify death. It does not belittle life. It simply asks, what if existence is not always the answer? And if we accept that, a new idea arises, quite strange and devastating. Perhaps the most merciful thing is not to end suffering, but to erase the memory that suffering ever occurred, the right to forget existence. When mercy means erasing the self that you have lived, a life perhaps painful, perhaps beautiful, perhaps both, you have carried with you memories that have shaped you. You have loved, you have lost, you have endured, you have transformed. But what if one day you would not want to remember any of it? Not only the pain, not only the mistakes, but everything, the complete fact of having existed. The right to forget existence is the idea that memory is not only personal, ontological, that to remember is to be, and to completely forget is to cease to be. It is not suicide, it is not sleeping, but a quiet disappearance of the narrative that once contained your name. We think of memory as something sacred, a source of meaning, the proof that we have lived. But what if memory is the weight that keeps us tied to suffering? And what if forgetting not only trauma, but identity is the ultimate freedom? Some dream of eternal life, others of peace after death. But this is something completely different. The right to step out of the timeline, to dissolve the self without a trace, to free the universe from having had to carry you without monuments, without echoes, without legacy, only the silence that comes when a story no longer needs to be told. But is it moral to forget existence in face of responsibility or a liberation from injustice? Will we cry for someone who chose it or envy them? Could we perhaps understand the mind that longed for this type of disappearance, and what happens to pain in a world in which no one is remembered, in which grief has nothing to cling to? Does the pain fade or sharpen in the absence of something to cling to? Perhaps forgetting is not escaping. Perhaps it is the culmination, the last line of a story that was never destined to resonate, an ending so clean that it leaves no trace of sound. And even deeper, what if that choice already occurred? What if some souls, before being born, before time, chose this? To come here once and then leave completely, not with violence or pain, but with a gentle undoing of every moment that occurred. We cling to memory as if it would save us. But what if forgetting is the final act of grace? Or perhaps grace itself was never intended to elevate us, but to let us go, dissolve the border between the self and silence, and disappear without needing to be rescued. The inversion of grace when redemption demands ruin? They taught you that grace is light, that it finds you in the darkness and pushes you upwards, that mercy is a gentle forgiveness, a gentle, clean salvation, that rupture is the beginning of healing, and that healing is the end of the story. But what if grace is not gentle, and if it does not save you from ruin, but takes you deeper into it? The inversion of grace is the idea that true transformation does not come with comfort, kindness, or peace, but when everything is stripped away, not purified, but shattered. It is the moment when you lose everything and discover that nothing comes to replace it, not even yourself. From this point of view, grace is not a bomb, but a sword that pierces the illusion, dismantles identity, tears you from everything you once believed completed you. It does not come to calm, it comes to undo. And in that undoing, something happens. You stop reaching, you stop pretending, you stop trying to deserve anything at all. And in that collapse in which all the moral architecture to which you clung has failed, you find a strange clarity, not peace, not purpose, just a freedom to no longer need any of that. You stop negotiating with the universe. You stop asking to be made whole. You stop hoping that justice, closure, or meaning will come as a reward. Because in this inverted grace, there is no reward. There is no vindication. Only what remains after everything has burned remains. Some would call it despair, but in the inversion, despair is not the enemy. It is the gateway, the burning of everything false until there is nothing left but the naked, the unredeemed, the unbearably real. And in that silence, grace is no longer something that elevates you. It is something that allows you to fall completely, finally, without resistance, gives up the performance of redemption, refuses to rescue you from the truth. Instead, stays by your side while everything collapses and only asks this: can you love what remains? Because perhaps the deepest mercy is not being caught, but being allowed to drop all the masks, all the hopes, all the names and fall to the bottom, to see what is beneath the story, to face the rubble without asking it to become something else, and still find at the bottom of everything that you are never less real for being broken, only more so. If you have made it this far, then something of these quiet and difficult ideas has stayed with you. Perhaps it has disturbed you, perhaps it has made you feel less alone, or perhaps it has only given you permission to think the thoughts that most people avoid. Either way, I'm glad you've been here. If you want to continue exploring these types of dark, delicate, and irresolvable questions, feel free to stay close. You know what to do. And if something in this video has awakened in you something that I am not glad you have been here. If you want to continue exploring these types of dark, delicate, and irresolvable questions, do not hesitate to stay close. You know what to do. And if something in this video has awakened something that you do not know how to name, I would love to know what it is. Thank you, and see you next time.